Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. This story takes me back to a time when I was much younger, fresh out of college, and desperate for a steady paycheck. It was the fall of 2006, and I had just landed a job as a night security guard at a hospital in a small, rural town. The hospital itself was massive, an old building that had been around for decades, maybe longer. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in black and white photos, with its Gothic architecture, towering spires, and long, echoing hallways. The hospital wasn't fully operational anymore. Only one wing was active, catering to a handful of patients during the day. The rest of the building, its abandoned wards, empty operating rooms, and sprawling basement, was completely shut off. My job was to patrol those unused areas, ensuring no trespassers wandered in. It sounded easy enough, and honestly, I thought it would be boring. My supervisor was an older man named Mr. Hanley. He was one of those guys who had seen it all, been working there for decades, and didn't have much patience for small talk. Stick to the job, stay out of trouble, and don't go poking around where you don't need to be, he had said during my first shift. His tone was casual, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he meant every word. There were three of us working night shifts, myself, an older guy named David, and a younger guy, Luis, who was still in college and worked part-time. We rotated our routes each night, so no one was stuck with the creepier parts of the building for too long. David often joked about the hospital being haunted, but I shrugged it off. Old buildings make noises, he'd tell him. That doesn't mean there's anything supernatural going on. My routine was simple. I'd clock in at 9 p.m., grab a flashlight and a walkie-talkie, and start my rounds. The hallways of the abandoned sections were eerily quiet, except for the occasional creak of old pipes or the distant hum of the heating system. The lights barely worked in some areas, flickering and casting strange shadows on the peeling walls. On my first night, I remember walking past what used to be the pediatric ward. The door was locked, but I could see through the small, wired glass window. Inside, the room was littered with forgotten furniture, tiny chairs, a rocking horse, and a few scattered toys. The sight made me feel uneasy, though I couldn't quite explain why. Despite the eerie atmosphere, the first few nights passed without incident. I'd walk the halls, radio in to let Mr. Hanley know I was still alive, and count down the hours until my shift ended. It wasn't exactly thrilling work, but the pay was decent, and I figured I'd stick with it until something better came along. The hospital had its quirks. The elevators in the abandoned wings sometimes moved on their own, and doors that I was sure I had locked would occasionally be ajar when I came back around. I chalked it up to faulty mechanics and the building's age. Luis, on the other hand, loved to joke about ghosts. It's probably the old nurses coming back to check on us, he'd say with a grin. I'd laugh it off, even though his comments sometimes made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. One night, during a break, David told me a story about the hospital's past. You know this place was a sanatorium during the 1920s, right? He said, leaning back in his chair. Back then, they used to treat tuberculosis patients here. Most of them never left. I raised an eyebrow. I thought it was just a regular hospital. It is now, David replied. But back then, this place had a reputation. They tried all kinds of experimental treatments, stuff that would be considered barbaric today. Rumor has it, they even had a wing where they kept the patients who, well, lost their minds. Luis, who had been scrolling through his phone, looked up. You're just trying to freak him out. David smirked, but didn't say anything else. I tried to laugh it off, but that conversation stuck with me. By my second week, I had settled into a routine. I'd bring a thermos of coffee, keep my walkie-talkie clipped to my belt, and zone out during my rounds, counting down the hours until sunrise. But something about the hospital's abandoned sections always felt off. It wasn't just the silence or the shadows. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. I remember one particular night. It was unusually cold, and a dense fog had rolled in, shrouding the hospital's exterior in an almost dreamlike haze. Inside, the air felt heavier than usual. As I walked down one of the long, dimly lit hallways, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. It felt like someone was following me, though I knew that was impossible. That night, I decided to take a break in the small security office located near the active wing of the hospital. Luis was there, munching on a bag of chips and watching something on his phone. "Anything exciting happened tonight?" I asked, hoping to lighten the mood. Luis shook his head. Same old, same old. You?" I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to mention the odd feeling it had earlier. But before I could say anything, Mr. Hanley's voice crackled over the radio. "One of you head down to the basement. There's a noise complaint from one of the nurses." Luis groaned. "It's probably just the pipes again." "Yeah," I replied, though my stomach tightened at the thought of going down there. The basement was the one part of the hospital I hated the most. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the stairwell. The descent felt longer than usual, and with each step, the air grew colder. When I reached the bottom, I paused, listening. The basement was a maze of storage rooms, old medical equipment, and narrow corridors. I walked slowly, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. At first, I didn't hear anything, but as I moved further in, a faint tapping sound caught my attention. I froze, heart pounding. The sound was coming from one of the storage rooms up ahead. And that's where things started to get strange. The tapping grew louder as I inched toward the storage room door. It wasn't rhythmic or mechanical, just sporadic, like someone idly drumming their fingers on a surface. My flashlight's beam wavered as my hand trembled slightly. I stopped in front of the door, which was slightly ajar. "Hello?" My voice echoed faintly in the cold, stale air. No response. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking loudly in protest. The room was cluttered with old hospital beds, filing cabinets, and cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls. A faint smell of mildew hung in the air. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. I scanned the room with my flashlight, sweeping it across the dusty surfaces and cobwebbed corners. But as I stepped inside, the tapping started again, this time directly behind me. I spun around so fast that I nearly dropped the flashlight. The door I had just walked through was still open, but there was no one there. My pulse quickened as I backed up a step, bumping into a rusted metal cabinet. "Luis, you better not be messing with me," I muttered under my breath, my voice shaky. I grabbed my radio and pressed the button. "Luis, you there?" A burst of static came through before his voice replied. "Yeah, what's up? Are you in the basement right now?" There was a pause. No, I'm still in the office." "Why?" I hesitated, my mind racing. "No reason, just checking." I released the button and stared at the doorway for a moment longer before quickly stepping out of the room. As I made my way back through the corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching me. My footsteps echoed eerily, each one sounding louder than the last. When I finally climbed the stairs and emerged back into the main hallway, I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Luis looked up from his phone as I entered the security office. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a chuckle. I forced a laugh, trying to play it off. "Just the basement being creepy as usual," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee from the thermos. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about the tapping. It had sounded so deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I told myself it was probably just a loose pipe or the old building settling, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. The next night, I decided to keep my guard up. I checked my flashlight and radio twice before starting my rounds, determined to stay focused. Everything seemed normal at first. The active wing was quiet, and the abandoned sections were as empty and eerie as ever. But as I walked past the pediatric ward, I noticed something odd. One of the tiny chairs inside the room had been moved. It was now sitting directly in front of the window, facing out toward the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I was certain that chair hadn't been there the night before. The room was locked, and I didn't have the key, only Mr. Hanley did. I stared at the chair for what felt like an eternity, half expecting it to move again. But it didn't. Taking a deep breath, I continued down the hallway, my footsteps quicker than before. When I passed by the same spot an hour later, the chair was gone. This time, I stopped and peered through the window, shining my flashlight inside. The chair was back in its original spot, surrounded by the other forgotten furniture. My stomach churned as I stepped back, trying to process what I had just seen. I decided not to tell anyone about it. Luis would just laugh it off, and Mr. Hanley would probably give me one of his stern, no-nonsense lectures about staying focused on my job. So I kept it to myself, hoping it was just my imagination. But the following night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. It was just past midnight when I heard the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the abandoned wing. They weren't my own. I was standing still at the time, listening intently. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway toward me. I turned off my flashlight, holding my breath as I strained to see in the dim light. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped just a few feet away. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. I fumbled with my flashlight, flicking it back on and sweeping the beam across the hallway. It was empty. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart racing, before forcing myself to move. I radioed Luis, my voice barely steady. "Hey, are you anywhere near the abandoned wing right now?" No," he replied, sounding confused. "Why?" I didn't answer. Instead, I quickly made my way back to the active wing, my hands shaking as I opened the door to the security office. Luis looked up from his phone, a frown on his face. "What's going on?" I hesitated, unsure how to explain what I had just experienced. Finally, I said, "I heard footsteps in the abandoned wing, but no one was there." Luis stared at me for a moment before breaking into a grin. "Man, you're letting this place get to you. It's probably just the pipes or something." I didn't argue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next few nights, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Lights would flicker even when there was no electrical issue, and I'd hear faint voices whispering in the distance, though I could never make out what they were saying. I started to dread my shifts, especially when I was assigned to patrol the abandoned sections alone. Every creak, every shadow, every flicker of light set my nerves on edge. David, noticing my unease, tried to reassure me. "This place has a lot of history," he said one night during a break. "Old buildings like this, they have a way of messing with your head. Just stick to your routine and you'll be fine." But I wasn't sure I believed him anymore. The hospital didn't just feel old, it felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting for something. The breaking point came on a cold, rainy night toward the end of my second week. I was walking past the pediatric ward again when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Through the small glass window, I saw a figure standing in the room. It was a woman in a long, white gown, her back turned to me. Her hair was dark and unkempt, cascading down her back in tangled waves. I froze, unable to look away. My first thought was that it must be a mannequin or some kind of leftover prop from the hospital's past. But then she moved. She turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see the pale outline of her face. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and staring directly at me. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my flashlight, and ran down the hallway without looking back. When I reached the security office, I burst through the door, out of breath and shaking. Luis jumped to his feet. "What happened?" I couldn't bring myself to say it. Instead, I sank into a chair, my hands trembling as I tried to process what I had just seen. For the rest of the night, I refused to leave the security office. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those hollow eyes staring back at me. The next night, I clocked in for my shift with a growing sense of dread. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly during the drive to the hospital, and I found myself glancing at the rearview mirror far more often than usual, as if expecting to see something or someone sitting in the back seat. The rain was unrelenting, streaking the windows of my car and amplifying the unease that had taken root in me since the encounter in the pediatric ward. When I arrived, Luis greeted me with his usual casual demeanor, but even he could tell something was off. "You good, man?" he asked, his brow furrowing. I hesitated before answering. "Yeah, just tired." It was a half-truth, but I wasn't about to explain that I hadn't slept much since the incident with the figure in white. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her hollow gaze, and every time I thought it managed to push the image from my mind, the memory would resurface, sharper than before. Luis shrugged and handed me the keys to the office. "Well, you're on your own tonight. I've got paperwork to finish, so we'll be in the admin building if you need me." I nodded and headed out to begin my rounds, determined to keep my wits about me. But as I walked through the deserted hallways, the silence felt heavier than before. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, flickering now and then, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. The first incident that night was subtle. As I passed by the old surgical wing, I noticed a faint light coming from one of the rooms. The door was slightly ajar, and the pale glow spilled out into the hallway like a beacon. I stopped, my pulse quickening. The power had been cut to this section of the hospital years ago, and there was no reason for a light to be on. I gripped my flashlight and approached the door cautiously. The light flickered, dimmed, and then vanished entirely just as I reached it. I pushed the door open and shined my flashlight inside. The room was empty, save for a few dusty gurneys and a cluster of surgical equipment piled haphazardly in the corner. The air was thick with the metallic tang of rust and the faint, musty smell of decay. I scanned the room, my beam catching on something written on the far wall. At first, I thought it was graffiti, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was something far stranger. The words were scrawled in a shaky, uneven hand, as if written in haste. "Leave now." The letters were jagged and uneven, as if someone had scratched them into the paint with a sharp object. My stomach churned as I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I stumbled out of the room, my mind racing. I told myself it was probably some leftover graffiti from when the building had been abandoned. Maybe a trespasser had snuck in years ago and decided to leave their mark. But deep down, I knew that didn't explain the light or the growing sense of unease that seemed to cling to me like a second skin. Over the next few nights, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Doors that I knew I had closed would be open when I returned, and objects seemed to move on their own. One night, I found a wheelchair sitting in the middle of the hallway, its wheels still faintly spinning as if it had just been pushed. The whispers started soon after. At first, they were so faint that I thought I was imagining them, just the wind slipping through the cracks in the old building. But as the nights went on, they grew louder and more distinct. They always seemed to come from just around the corner or behind a closed door, faint and indistinct, but undeniably human. Sometimes I thought I could make out individual words, but they were always just out of reach, like the memory of a dream slipping away as you tried to recall it. I started carrying my radio with me everywhere, keeping it clipped to my belt and turned up just loud enough to drown out the whispers. But even that wasn't enough to keep the unease at bay. One night, I decided it had enough. I waited until my shift was over and approached Luis in the security office. "We need to check the basement," I said, my voice firm despite the knot of fear in my stomach. Luis raised an eyebrow. "The basement? Why?" "Because something's going on down there," I said. "Lights turning on, things moving. I don't know how to explain it, but I can't keep ignoring it." Luis hesitated, then sighed. "All right, fine. Let's check it out. But if we don't find anything, you owe me a coffee." We grabbed our flashlights and headed down the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was even darker and more oppressive than I remembered, the walls seeming to close in around us as we made our way through the narrow corridors. We checked room after room, finding nothing but dust and decay. But just as we were about to call it quits, we heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping echoing down the hallway. Luis froze, his flashlight beam shaking slightly. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's coming from the storage room." We approached the door together, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The tapping grew louder as we neared, more insistent. Luis reached for the doorknob and turned it slowly, pushing the door open with a creak. The room was dark, and the beam of our flashlights illuminated rows of shelves filled with dusty medical supplies. The tapping stopped the moment we stepped inside. We searched the room thoroughly, checking every corner and shadow, but there was no one there. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's aging ventilation system. Luis looked at me, his expression a mix of confusion and unease. "All right, I'm officially freaked out," he admitted. "Join the club," I muttered, my flashlight sweeping across the shelves one last time. As we turned to leave, something caught my eye. Sitting on one of the shelves was an old leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn with age. I picked it up, brushing off a layer of dust, and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and precise, but the words sent a chill down my spine. The voices won't stop. They're everywhere. I can't escape them. I flipped through the pages, each one filled with frantic, desperate entries. The author, whose name wasn't listed, had worked in the hospital years ago and had documented their experiences in painstaking detail. They wrote about seeing shadowy figures, hearing whispers, and feeling an oppressive presence that seemed to follow them everywhere. Luis read over my shoulder, his face pale. This is messed up," he said. I nodded, my throat dry. "We need to show this to Mr. Hanley," I said, tucking the journal under my arm. As we made our way back to the security office, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, and every creak of the old building sent a jolt of fear through me. When we finally reached the office, I locked the door behind us and set the journal on the desk. Luis and I sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what we'd found pressing down on us like a physical force. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew the same thing. Whatever was happening in that hospital, it was far from over. And the deeper we looked, the more dangerous it seemed to become. Luis and I barely slept the next day. The journal we had found lingered in my mind like a phantom, its pages filled with accounts that mirrored what we had been experiencing. For hours, I read through it again and again, piecing together fragments of the past that painted a chilling picture. The writer had worked in the hospital during its last operational years, detailing a growing presence that had started subtle, like the whispers we'd heard, and escalated into violent manifestations. Their final entry was hastily written, the words uneven and jagged. "They found me. If you're reading this, leave while you still can." I couldn't shake the feeling that the writer's warning wasn't just for themselves, but for anyone who dared to linger in the hospital. That night, Luis and I returned to work with an unspoken agreement. We needed to get to the bottom of what was happening, even if it meant facing whatever was lurking in the shadows. The shift started uneventfully enough, though the silence in the hospital seemed thicker than usual. It wrapped around us like a suffocating fog, every sound amplified to an unbearable degree. The hum of the fluorescent lights felt deafening, and the creak of our footsteps on the old tile floors echoed endlessly. At around midnight, we decided to return to the basement to investigate further. Armed with flashlights, radios, and a growing sense of dread, we descended the stairs once more. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time we reached the bottom, our breath was visible in the dim light. We headed straight for the storage room where we had found the journal, but as we turned the corner, we froze in unison. The door to the room was wide open, though we had left it firmly closed the night before. My pulse quickened as I shined my flashlight into the room. The shelves were exactly as we had left them, except for one. On the shelf where we had found the journal, the objects had been rearranged to form a strange, circular pattern. In the center of the circle was a small, rusted scalpel, its blade glinting faintly in the dim light. "What the hell is this?" Luis whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, my throat dry. "But someone or something did this." As we stepped closer, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a wave of nausea washed over me. I reached out to touch the scalpel, but as my fingers brushed the cold metal, a deafening crash echoed through the room. Luis and I spun around, our flashlights darting wildly. The door to the storage room had slammed shut behind us, plunging us into near total darkness. "Open it," Luis shouted, his voice panicked. I rushed to the door, fumbling with the handle. It wouldn't budge. It was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. Suddenly, the whispers started again, soft at first, then growing louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, overlapping and echoing in a chaotic cacophony. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the noise. Luis nodded, his flashlight beam shaking. "What are they saying?" I strained to make out the words, but they were fragmented and disjointed, like a dozen conversations happening simultaneously. Then, amidst the chaos, one voice stood out, clear and deliberate. "Get out." The word sent a chill down my spine. I turned to Luis, my heart racing. "We need to leave. Now." Before he could respond, the room was plunged into complete darkness. Our flashlights flickered and died simultaneously, leaving us in an oppressive void. And then we saw it. At first, it was just a faint outline in the darkness, barely visible against the inky blackness. But as it moved closer, it took shape, a tall, shadowy figure with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light around them. Luis gasped, stumbling backward. "What is that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice shaking. "But don't take your eyes off it." The figure stood motionless for a moment, its gaze fixed on us. Then, without warning, it lunged forward. The room erupted into chaos. Luis and I scrambled to get away, knocking over shelves and sending supplies crashing to the floor. The whispers grew louder, nearly deafening, as the figure pursued us. We reached the door and threw ourselves against it, pounding on the wood with all our strength. "Let us out," Luis shouted, his voice raw with desperation. Finally, the door gave way, and we stumbled into the hallway. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of our ragged breathing. But the figure wasn't finished. It appeared in the doorway, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. "We can't outrun it," Luis said, his voice trembling. "What do we do?" I didn't have an answer. My mind raced as I tried to think of a way to escape, but the figure was closing in, its presence suffocating. In a moment of sheer instinct, I grabbed the journal from my bag and held it up. "What do you want from us?" I shouted. The figure stopped, its gaze fixed on the journal. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then, it spoke. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was low and guttural, sending a shiver through my entire body. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed toward the exit at the end of the hallway. Luis and I didn't need to be told twice. We ran as fast as we could, our footsteps echoing in the silence. The figure didn't follow, but its presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. When we finally burst out into the parking lot, the cold night air hit us like a slap. We collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath. What the hell was that?" Luis asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I replied, clutching the journal tightly. "But I think it wanted us to leave, and I don't think it's going to let us come back." We sat there for what felt like hours, too afraid to move. The hospital loomed behind us, its windows dark and foreboding. Eventually, Luis broke the silence. "We need to tell Mr. Hanley about this," he said. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what we could possibly say. How could we explain what we had seen? Would anyone even believe us? As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't seen the last of that figure. The hospital had its secrets, and whatever was haunting it wasn't going to let them go easily. Luis and I didn't say much during the drive home that night. The air inside the car was thick with tension, both of us lost in our own thoughts, replaying the events of the night over and over again. The figure's hollow eyes, its guttural voice, the journal in my hands, it all felt surreal, like some feverish nightmare that we had woken up from but couldn't entirely escape. The streets were eerily quiet as we sped away from the hospital, the dim glow of streetlights casting fleeting shadows on the dashboard. I clutched the journal in my lap, its worn cover and brittle pages feeling heavier than they had any right to. Every few seconds, Luis glanced at me, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "What do we even do now?" Luis finally asked, breaking the silence. His voice was shaky, and he didn't take his eyes off the road. "I don't know," I replied honestly. "But we can't go back there. Whatever's in that hospital, it doesn't want us there. And honestly, I don't want to find out what happens if we don't listen." Luis nodded, though the tension in his jaw didn't ease. "What about Mr. Hanley? He's going to want an explanation if we suddenly quit." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Mr. Hanley wasn't the type to take excuses lightly, and haunted hospital wasn't exactly something you could put on a resignation letter. Still, I knew there was no way I could walk back into that building after what we'd experienced. "We'll have to figure something out," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. When we finally pulled up to my apartment complex, the clock on the dashboard read 4:17 a.m. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the faintest hint of dawn creeping over the horizon. Luis parked the car and turned to me, his face pale and drawn. "You sure you're going to be okay?" he asked. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "Yeah, just get some rest, okay? We'll talk later." Luis hesitated for a moment, then gave a small nod. "You too, man. And don't open that journal again, all right? Just don't." I didn't respond, but his words stayed with me as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. The next few days passed in a blur. I called in sick to work, unable to face the thought of stepping foot in the hospital again. Luis did the same, though we kept in touch over the phone, exchanging fragmented thoughts and theories about what we had experienced. The journal sat on my desk, untouched, its presence a constant reminder of that night. Every time I looked at it, a wave of unease washed over me, as if the object itself was somehow alive, watching me, waiting for me to open it again. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, its hollow eyes, its shadowy form, its outstretched hand pointing toward the exit. I heard its voice, low and guttural, echoing in my mind. "You shouldn't be here." The whispers haunted me too. Even in the safety of my apartment, I thought I could hear them sometimes, faint and distant, like a radio tuned to the wrong station. It'd turn off the TV, unplug everything, sit in absolute silence, and still, they'd persist, just at the edge of my hearing. Luis wasn't doing much better. He called me one night, his voice frantic. I think it followed me," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart sinking. "I've been hearing things," he said. "The whispers. At first, I thought it was just in my head, but last night, I swear I saw something in the hallway outside my bedroom. It was just for a second, but I don't know, man. I feel like I'm losing my mind." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to reassure him, to tell him it was just his imagination. But how could I, when I was experiencing the same thing? A few days later, Luis and I decided to meet in person. We needed to figure out what to do, about the hospital, about the journal, about everything. We met at a diner a few blocks from my apartment, the kind of place that was open 24 hours and always smelled faintly of burnt coffee. The fluorescent lights inside were a harsh contrast to the dim evening outside, and the clatter of plates and silverware provided a strange sense of normalcy. Luis looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, and he had dark circles under them, as if he hadn't slept in days. I probably didn't look much better. "We can't keep living like this," he said, stirring his coffee absently. "Some things gotta give." "I know," I replied. "But what are we supposed to do? Go back to the hospital? Try to fix whatever's happening? That's insane." Luis shook his head. "I don't think we have a choice. Whatever this is, it's not going to stop until we do something." I wanted to argue, but deep down, I knew he was right. The whispers, the figure, the journal, it all felt like part of some larger puzzle, one that we hadn't fully pieced together yet. Reluctantly, we made a plan. We would go back to the hospital one last time, not to work, but to try to understand what was happening. Maybe we could find some clue in the journal or in the basement that would help us put an end to this nightmare. The following night, we returned to the hospital. The parking lot was empty, the building looming above us like a dark monolith. The windows were black, reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights, and the air was unnaturally still. As we approached the entrance, my stomach churned with anxiety. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to get back in the car and drive as far away as possible. But I forced myself to keep moving, Luis by my side. Inside, the hospital was just as we had left it, silent, cold, and oppressive. The air felt heavier than before, as if the building itself was alive and watching us. We headed straight for the basement, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The whispers started almost immediately, faint and distant, but growing louder with each step. When we reached the storage room, the door was open again, just as it had been the last time. But this time, the strange circular pattern on the shelf had been replaced with something else. The journal, lying open, its pages blank except for a single word scrawled in the center of the page. "Why?" My breath caught in my throat. Luis leaned closer, his flashlight illuminating the page. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The night we returned to the hospital was the last time Luis and I ever set foot in that place. What happened in that basement, in those final moments, is something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Even now, months later, it feels like a fragment of a nightmare, a jagged piece of some dark puzzle that refuses to fit into the reality I thought I knew. When the door slammed shut, trapping us in the storage room, it wasn't just the darkness or the deafening roar of whispers that paralyzed me. It was the overwhelming feeling of being utterly and completely unwelcome. The air in the room seemed to shift, growing colder and heavier, pressing down on us like an invisible weight. Luis and I stood frozen, our flashlights shaking in our hands. The journal on the shelf seemed to pulse with a strange, otherworldly energy. The single word, "Why?" etched on its page, now glowing faintly in the dim light. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, until they weren't just sounds anymore. They were words. Dozens of voices overlapping, speaking in fragmented sentences, their tones filled with anger, despair, and something else. Something I can only describe as desperation. "Leave. Not yours. Stolen. Betrayed." Luis grabbed my arm, his grip tight enough to hurt. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. But as we turned toward the door, it became painfully clear that we weren't alone in the room. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form barely discernible in the dim light. It wasn't the same entity we had seen before. This one was different, more defined. Its face was pale and gaunt, its eyes hollow and unseeing. It wore what looked like a hospital gown, the fabric torn and stained, and its movements were slow and deliberate, as if it were struggling to exist in the space it occupied. It didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming. The whispers seemed to emanate from it, growing louder and more chaotic with every step it took toward us. Luis and I backed away, our flashlights flickering as if the batteries were suddenly dying. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "Stay back," Luis shouted, though his voice cracked with fear. The figure didn't stop. It raised one hand, pointing at the journal on the shelf, and for a moment, the whispers quieted, replaced by a single, chilling sentence that seemed to echo through the room. "You took what was never yours." The journal flew off the shelf, landing at my feet, its pages flipping wildly as if caught in a strong wind. Images and words flashed across the paper, drawings of the hospital, lists of names, fragments of stories that didn't make sense. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The journal lay open on the floor, its final page blank, except for one sentence, written in bold, black ink. "You cannot escape what you've awakened." At that moment, the figure let out a bone-chilling scream, a sound so loud and piercing it felt like my skull was splitting in two. Luis grabbed my arm, and we bolted for the door. It didn't matter that it had been locked moments before. When we reached it, it swung open as if propelled by some unseen force. We ran through the basement, up the stairs, and out of the hospital, not stopping until we were back in Louis' car. The drive home was a blur. Neither of us spoke. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the pounding of my own heart. When Luis dropped me off at my apartment, he didn't even wait for me to close the door before speeding away. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my couch, the journal on the coffee table in front of me, its presence feeling like a ticking time bomb. I knew I couldn't keep it, couldn't risk whatever curse or energy it carried affecting me any further. The next morning, I took the journal to the nearest river and threw it in. As I watched it sink beneath the surface, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that it was no longer in my possession, and dread that it might not be the end. In the weeks that followed, Luis and I both quit our jobs at the hospital. Mr. Hanley wasn't happy, but we didn't care. The whispers didn't stop right away, but they grew quieter over time, fading into the background until they were almost imperceptible. Almost. Luis moved to another city, needing to put as much distance as possible between himself and the hospital. We stayed in touch for a while, but our conversations grew less frequent. The memories of that night something neither of us wanted to revisit. As for me, I've done my best to move on, but the experience changed me in ways I can't fully explain. I don't sleep as well as I used to, and I keep a nightlight on, something I haven't done since I was a kid. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear whispers. Faint, distant, like a breeze passing through an empty room. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I'm not so sure. Looking back, I've come to realize that some questions are better left unanswered, some mysteries better left unsolved. The hospital, the journal, the figure in the basement, they're part of a world I can't begin to understand, a world I never wanted to be a part of. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that curiosity can be dangerous. Sometimes, when something tells you to leave, you should listen, because not everything that's lost is meant to be found. And as I sit here, sharing this story with you, I can only hope that it stays just that, a story. A memory of a night that Luis and I survived, but one that will haunt us for the rest of our lives. So, if you ever find yourself in a place that feels wrong, a place where the air feels heavy and the shadows seem to move on their own, do yourself a favor. Don't stay. Leave while you still can. Because some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed. Let me take you back to a time when I thought nothing in this world could faze me. It was the summer of 2012, a few months after I had graduated college. I was a restless 22-year-old, eager for adventure and desperate to get out of the city. My best friend, Liam, shared my sentiment. He was a lot like me in that way, always searching for something beyond the mundane. We left early one Saturday morning, Liam driving his beat-up sedan while I manned the playlist. The ride was long but enjoyable. It was the kind of journey where the miles felt lighter with each laugh shared and every stupid story we retold for the thousandth time. The further north we went, the thinner the traffic became, and the denser the forest on either side of the road grew. By the time we reached the nearest town, it felt like we had stepped back in time. The town itself was quaint, dotted with small brick buildings, mom and pop diners, and a single gas station that looked older than both of us combined. We stopped there to ask for directions, and the old man behind the counter didn't even look up from his newspaper as he muttered, "Keep going until the trees break and you see the ocean. You can't miss it." He wasn't lying. About 20 minutes after leaving the town, the forest abruptly gave way to open cliffs and the crashing sound of waves below. It was breathtaking, the kind of view you don't forget. There, perched precariously on the edge of the rocky coast, stood the lighthouse. It was taller than I had imagined, its white and red exterior weathered from years of battling the sea's salty spray. We parked at the base of the hill that led up to the lighthouse, grabbing our duffel bags and a week's worth of supplies from the trunk. Patrick had told us the place had a generator and running water, but warned us it wasn't the most modern setup. Old but functional, Head said with a laugh. The path leading to the lighthouse was narrow and uneven, and the closer we got, the more I noticed the silence. It wasn't the kind of quiet you find in a library or a sleepy suburb. It was heavier, like the landscape itself had sucked the sound out of the air. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the steady roar of the waves far below. Inside, the lighthouse was exactly what it expected. The ground floor was a circular living space with an old wooden table, a pair of mismatched chairs, and a small kitchen tucked into the corner. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with dusty volumes, and the air smelled faintly of salt and mildew. A steep spiral staircase led up to the lamp room, which we saved for later exploration. We spent the first day settling in, unpacking our things, and getting the generator up and running. It sputtered to life with a groan, and the dim overhead lights flickered before holding steady. We laughed at how eerie the place felt, joking that we'd accidentally booked a horror movie set instead of a vacation. The nights were something else entirely. By the time the sun set, the world outside the lighthouse was pitch black, the ocean blending seamlessly into the horizon. The beam from the lamp room, though long retired, still worked as a kind of security light, casting its weak glow in slow, methodical sweeps across the water. Liam and I spent those first few nights on the ground floor, playing cards and talking about everything and nothing. There was no TV, no internet, no distractions. It was peaceful in its own way. The lighthouse had a charm to it, despite its age and isolation. On the third day, we decided to explore the surrounding cliffs. We packed sandwiches and a thermos of coffee, setting out just after sunrise. The path down to the shore was steep and treacherous, but the reward was worth it. The tide pools were teeming with life, small crabs scuttling under rocks, and starfish clinging to the edges of shallow water. As we climbed back up, I noticed something strange. At the very top of the cliff, just outside the lighthouse, there was a small figure standing still, facing the ocean. From that distance, I couldn't make out any details, but it struck me as odd. We hadn't seen another soul since arriving, and Patrick had been clear that no one else used the property. When I pointed it out to Liam, he squinted and said, "Probably just a trick of the light." I nodded, but the unease lingered. By the time we reached the top, the figure, if it had ever been there, was gone. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. We cooked dinner, watched the sunset from the cliffs, and played cards until we were too tired to keep our eyes open. But that night, as I lay in bed listening to the distant crash of waves, I couldn't shake the image of that figure. The first strange event crept in so subtly that at first I brushed it off entirely. It started on our fourth day at the lighthouse, just when I was beginning to feel fully settled into the routine. The morning came quietly, with the sky overcast and the air heavy with the scent of rain. Liam and I had agreed to use the day to finally climb the spiral staircase to the top of the lighthouse and see the old lamp room. Breakfast was simple: instant oatmeal and lukewarm coffee heated on the old gas stove. As we ate, the atmosphere felt oddly different. It wasn't anything I could put into words. The lighthouse just felt heavier than morning. Liam laughed when I mentioned it. "Maybe the storm coming in is messing with your head," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the otherwise quiet room. He had a point. The sky outside had grown darker, and the waves crashing against the cliffs seemed angrier than usual. By mid-morning, we decided to make good on our plan. Armed with flashlights and a healthy sense of curiosity, we ascended the narrow spiral staircase. The steps creaked under our weight, and the higher we climbed, the more the sound of the ocean below faded into an eerie silence. The lamp room itself was just as dusty and weathered as the rest of the lighthouse. The massive Fresnel lens, once the beacon for ships navigating the treacherous coastline, stood dormant in the center of the room. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs clung to the windows that encircled the space. We spent about an hour exploring, snapping pictures on Liam's old camera and poking around the machinery. It was fascinating in its way, a piece of history frozen in time. But then, just as we were getting ready to head back down, I noticed something. One of the windows had a single, clean handprint on the inside of the glass. It was small, too small to belong to either Liam or me, and it stood out starkly against the dusty surface. I called Liam over, and his expression shifted from curious to uneasy as he examined it. "That's weird," he muttered, running his fingers just above the glass without touching it. "You think Patrick's been up here recently?" I shook my head. "He said no one's used this place in years. Besides, why would he just leave a single handprint and not clean anything else?" Liam shrugged, but his usual easygoing demeanor seemed to falter. "Maybe someone was here before us," he offered, though he didn't sound convinced. We chalked it up to a quirk of the old building and headed back downstairs, but the image of that handprint stuck with me. I couldn't help but think about the figure I'd seen on the cliffs the day before, and for the first time since arriving, the isolation of the lighthouse felt less like a retreat and more like a vulnerability. That night, the wind picked up, howling against the lighthouse walls like some wild animal. The generator sputtered more than usual, the lights flickering ominously as we ate our dinner of canned soup. We didn't talk much, each of us lost in our own thoughts. It was just after midnight when I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Liam, but then I heard his soft snore from the other side of the room. The footsteps weren't coming from inside the room either. They were above us, faint but deliberate, pacing back and forth in the lamp room. My heart began to race as I strained to listen. The footsteps were slow and steady, the sound unmistakable. I nudged Liam awake, whispering, "Do you hear that?" He sat up groggily, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" "Footsteps," I hissed. "Upstairs." He froze, listening intently. For a moment, there was nothing but the wind rattling the windows. Then, just as I began to doubt myself, the footsteps started again. Liam's expression hardened, and he grabbed the flashlight from beside his bed. "Stay here," he said, his voice low. "No way," I shot back, grabbing my own flashlight. "If someone's up there, I'm not letting you go alone." Reluctantly, he nodded, and we made our way to the staircase. The creaking steps seemed louder than ever as we ascended, each one echoing in the silence. When we reached the top, the lamp room was empty. The handprint was still there, but the dust on the floor was undisturbed. "Maybe it was just the wind," Liam said, though he didn't sound convinced. We returned to the ground floor, but neither of us got much sleep after that. Every little noise seemed amplified, every shadow more sinister. The next day, the storm finally broke. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled so fiercely that it drowned out even the sound of the waves. We spent most of the day inside, playing cards and trying to pretend nothing had happened the night before. But the lighthouse had other plans. It started with the doors. We were sitting at the table, mid-game, when the heavy wooden door leading outside slammed shut with enough force to rattle the walls. We both jumped, staring at each other wide-eyed. "Did you lock it?" Liam asked, already halfway to the door. "I thought I did," I replied, following close behind him. When he pulled the door open, the wind nearly tore it from his hands. Outside, the storm raged on, sheets of rain obscuring the cliffs and ocean beyond. Liam stepped out just long enough to secure the door with a rusty latch before slamming it shut again. "Maybe the wind's getting in through the cracks," he suggested, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. But it wasn't just the door. Over the course of the day, small, unsettling things kept happening. The lights flickered more often than usual. The generator groaning loudly, as though struggling to keep up, a cup fell off the counter without warning, shattering on the floor. And then there were the whispers. At first, I thought I was imagining them, a faint, almost inaudible murmuring that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I didn't say anything, thinking the storm was playing tricks on my ears. But then I saw Liam freeze mid-sentence, his eyes darting around the room. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my stomach twisting. "What did it sound like?" "Like voices," he said, his eyes narrowing as he tried to pinpoint the source. "But I can't make out what they're saying." Neither could I. The whispers were faint, almost like they were just on the edge of hearing, but they sent chills down my spine all the same. We spent the rest of the day in uneasy silence, each of us too afraid to voice what we were both starting to realize. Something wasn't right. The lighthouse, once a refuge, now felt like it was watching us, waiting for something. That night, as the storm continued to batter the coast, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my heart racing with every creak and groan of the old building. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was certain: we were no longer alone. The days following our first unsettling incident were filled with an unsettling stillness that seemed to cling to everything in the lighthouse. The storm had not let up, and it felt like we were trapped in a perpetual cycle of rain and wind. We would have to wait for the weather to clear before we could leave, but at that moment, the outdoors felt like an inhospitable and dangerous place. But it wasn't the storm that made me feel trapped. It was the lighthouse itself. At first, we tried to go on with our usual routine. We spent our mornings exploring the surrounding cliffs when the rain let up enough, taking photos of the wild landscape. But each day seemed to bring new, more frequent oddities. It started small, the walls creaking in the dead of night, the constant flicker of the generator, and the soft, barely audible sounds of footsteps, always from above us. It was as if the place was alive, breathing with us. I don't know how to explain it, but the air felt thick, almost oppressive. Then one evening, as the daylight dwindled and the heavy rain turned into a constant, drumming downpour, the temperature dropped suddenly. I could feel the chill in the air, creeping into my bones, and it seemed to come from the center of the building, where the staircase led to the top. Liam and I were sitting in the dining area when I noticed it. The warmth we had tried to generate with the gas stove wasn't holding. In fact, it was growing colder by the minute, as if the very walls of the lighthouse were absorbing the heat and leaving us shivering. "That's strange," Liam muttered, glancing at the old thermostat on the wall, though we both knew it wasn't much more than a relic from a time when the lighthouse was still operational. "The heater should have kicked on by now. This place is supposed to be insulated." "Maybe it's just the storm," I said, though I didn't feel reassured by my own words. I could tell Liam didn't either. There was something about the sudden shift that felt wrong. It wasn't just the cold, it was the weight of it, as if the air itself was pressing in on us. We decided to investigate, each of us silently agreeing that there had to be some rational explanation. Maybe the old pipes were frozen, or maybe the heating system was just failing from age. But as we made our way up the staircase, the temperature continued to plummet. The closer we got to the top, the more it felt like we were stepping into a freezer. It wasn't the storm, and it wasn't just the age of the building. Liam shone his flashlight around, and the beam illuminated the dust hanging in the air. But then something caught his attention. On the far side of the lamp room, near the tall windows, something moved. Just a flicker, a shadow that passed quickly across the wall. Liam's flashlight followed it, and I heard him take a sharp breath, his voice a hushed whisper. "Did you see that?" I didn't have to ask what he meant. I saw it too. It wasn't just the shadow of the storm outside. This was different. It was something that moved like it had weight, like it belonged inside the room with us, not in the weather outside. Without a word, we stepped further into the lamp room, but by the time we reached the spot, whatever it was had disappeared. The air was thick with tension, the chill so sharp now that it felt like it could cut through the fabric of your clothes. Liam exhaled sharply, clearly shaken. "We're not alone here." I felt that. "Did you?" I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. Something about that shadow didn't sit right with me. We decided to keep the lights on that night, but it didn't help. The temperature continued to dip lower, and though we kept the stove running, the chill seemed to seep in from somewhere deeper inside the lighthouse. Every so often, we'd hear something, a soft scraping sound like something being dragged across the floor above us. It was subtle, but it was enough to keep me awake, my eyes flicking to the door every few seconds, expecting someone or something to appear. And then there were the whispers again. They were louder this time, more distinct. At first, I thought I was just imagining things, but Liam's reaction said otherwise. He looked at me from across the room, his face pale, eyes wide with that unmistakable look of dread. "Do you hear it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I hear it," I replied, my pulse quickening. The whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves, swirling around us, impossible to pinpoint. They weren't loud, but they were persistent. Sometimes they sounded like muffled voices, too low to make out, and other times like a soft sigh, like the building itself was breathing. That was when we knew we weren't just hearing things. Something was definitely happening here. The next morning, when we went outside for a brief respite from the suffocating atmosphere inside, we found that the landscape had changed. The cliffs, usually rugged and untamed, now looked unfamiliar, warped somehow. The sea was churning violently, the waves crashing against the rocks with a ferocity that matched the strange unease we felt. I turned to Liam, but the look on his face told me he felt it too. "It's not right," he said, shaking his head. "I don't know what's going on, but this place, it's alive in a way I can't explain." "Maybe we should just leave," I suggested, but even as I said the words, I knew we wouldn't. We couldn't. The storm had trapped us here, and something deeper was pulling us in, keeping us locked in the lighthouse grasp. That night, after yet another failed attempt at a peaceful night's sleep, things took a turn for the worse. We were lying in bed, fully awake now, just waiting for the next thing to happen. I felt at first the unmistakable sensation of eyes on me. It was a prickling feeling at the back of my neck, and it made the hairs on my arms stand up. I tried to brush it off, but then I heard it, the soft creak of the door. It wasn't the wind. I knew it wasn't. The door was slightly ajar. I glanced over at Liam, who was sitting up in bed, his eyes wide with that same fear. He had heard it too. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, barely able to find my voice. Liam nodded. "There's something in here. Something. It's been with us this whole time, hasn't it?" I didn't want to believe it, but every instinct in my body screamed that he was right. We weren't alone in the lighthouse, and whatever it wasn't something that wanted us there. We tried to act brave, trying to reason with ourselves that it was just the stress of the storm, the isolation. But deep down, we both knew this wasn't just the weather. It wasn't just a creaky old lighthouse. There was something in this place with us, something we couldn't explain, and something that was getting stronger by the day. The investigation that followed was futile. No matter where we looked, no matter how hard we tried to make sense of the noises or the shadows, nothing could explain what was happening. We tried to calm ourselves, to rationalize everything, but nothing seemed right. The air felt thicker, the whispers louder, and every so often we would find ourselves staring at the walls, waiting for the next movement, the next sign that something or someone was watching us. And then, one night, it all became clear. It didn't start with a sound or a movement. It started with a sudden, inexplicable drop in the temperature, so cold that our breaths turned to mist before us. We looked at each other, unsure of what was coming. And that's when we saw it, standing just inside the doorway, staring at us with dark, hollow eyes. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a ghost. It was something else entirely. It was that night, the night when everything finally came to a head, that I understood with a terrifying clarity that there was no escape. The temperature had dropped so low that the frost on the windows was thick, blocking out any light from the storm outside. Liam and I were in the kitchen, once again trying to make sense of the strange occurrences. Neither of us had said much in the last few hours, both of us too consumed by a growing sense of dread that had settled into the pit of my stomach. We had tried to keep calm, tried to focus on the mundane, but the atmosphere in the lighthouse was too thick, too oppressive. I could feel it pressing down on me, each breath like I was inhaling something heavy. Every shadow in the corner of my eye, every sound from above, it all felt wrong. And it had only been getting worse. Liam was standing by the stove, fiddling with the old kettle, his back to me. I didn't realize that I was staring at him, my mind spiraling as the thoughts of the strange figure, the cold, the whispers, everything, all converged into a single horrifying realization. Something was in this lighthouse with us, and it was getting closer. I was about to turn away, to try and break the silence, when the sound came again. The same scraping sound we had heard before, faint at first, but growing in intensity. This time, however, it wasn't coming from above us, like it usually did. It was coming from right behind us. I froze. My body went rigid with fear as the sound, sharp and deliberate, scraped across the floorboards. I didn't have to look to know what it was. I could feel it. Something was moving through the dark, across the floor, heading straight for us. Liam's voice trembled as he spoke, though he tried to mask it. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, the fear clawing at me. "It's not the storm. It's here. It's coming." I could see him stiffen as he slowly turned, his eyes wide in disbelief. But the moment he turned, the door slammed shut with a violent bang. We both jumped, our hearts racing. The room plunged into an unnatural darkness, the dim light from the stove barely enough to see by. The silence that followed felt like it had weight, pressing in on us from all sides. Liam rushed to the door, attempting to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something, or someone, was holding it shut from the outside. His voice was frantic as he pushed against the door, trying to force it open. "This isn't happening. This isn't real." I stood frozen in place, watching him struggle, my pulse pounding in my ears. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not the normal creaks of the building settling, but heavy, deliberate steps. Footsteps that weren't ours. They were coming from the hallway. I felt the blood drain from my face as I turned toward the sound. The air around me seemed to grow colder, impossibly so, and I could see my breath puffing out in front of me. The room itself felt like it was closing in. It felt like the walls were alive, moving, shifting. I couldn't breathe properly. My body was numb, and the fear crawling up my spine was paralyzing. Liam finally turned from the door, his face pale. "It's not opening. We need to get out of here. Now." But it was too late. The door to the kitchen slowly creaked open by itself, and I could feel the sudden gust of cold air that rushed through it. It wasn't natural. This wasn't just the wind from outside. It was something more, something far colder, far darker. We both backed away instinctively, but the floor creaked beneath us. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to twist and stretch. And then, through the doorway, there it was. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a figure, really. It was a shape, a dark, formless silhouette that seemed to ripple and flicker, almost like smoke, yet it had substance, weight. It moved with a fluidity that felt unnatural, a predatory kind of grace. and its eyes. Those eyes, gleaming white in the darkness, were fixed on us. I couldn't scream. The air felt thick in my throat, and my body wouldn't respond. I tried to move, tried to shout at Liam to run, but I couldn't find my voice. My legs wouldn't move. It felt like I was frozen in place, trapped by the very presence of it. Liam's face went white as he backed away, but I saw the terror in his eyes as he looked over at me. He knew, as I did, that running wouldn't help us. We couldn't escape it. Not from here. It wasn't until the creature, whatever it was, moved closer that I finally found my voice. I could barely get the words out. What? What is that thing? Liam shook his head, his breath shallow. I don't know. I don't know, but it's not human. It's not anything I've ever seen. The thing, it wasn't just a shadow. It seemed to reach out with long, tendril-like arms, stretching toward us. Each movement sent a shudder down my spine. The temperature in the room dropped even further, if that was possible, and I could feel the icy touch of its presence creeping into my skin. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the thing stopped. It seemed to be examining us, studying us as if we were nothing more than prey. Liam turned to me, his eyes filled with panic. We need to get out of here now. If we don't leave, it's going to. Before he could finish, the creature lunged forward, its form shifting and flickering in a way that was impossible to follow. I felt a sudden surge of fear, like a wave crashing over me, pushing me to the edge of reason. I couldn't think. I could only act. I grabbed Liam's arm, yanking him back from the creature's reach, but it was already too late. It was on us. The air was thick with the smell of rot, and the darkness that poured from it engulfed everything. But the moment it touched us, just when I thought we were lost, there was a sudden, blinding flash of light. The entire lighthouse seemed to shake, and for a moment, I thought the building was going to collapse around us. Then, everything stopped. The light flickered out, and the temperature returned to normal. The creature, whatever it was gone. Liam and I stood there, gasping for breath, our hearts still racing in our chests. We didn't move. We didn't speak. We couldn't. The silence that followed was deafening, but we both knew. It wasn't over. We weren't safe. Not yet. The hours that followed the creature's disappearance felt like a blur. Liam and I didn't speak a word as we slowly backed away from the kitchen, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us. We weren't sure what to do, where to go, or even if it was safe to move. The room felt empty now, but that empty space was filled with a kind of lingering dread, a quiet, suffocating reminder that the creature wasn't gone. It wasn't finished with us. It had only retreated, waiting for the right moment to strike again. We stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity. My hands were shaking, and my heart raced in my chest. I could still feel the cold, that icy chill that had wrapped around me like a vice. Every inch of my skin felt like it had been touched by something unnatural, something that had no place in this world. It was as if the creature had left its mark on me, and I couldn't shake it off. Finally, Liam broke the silence. His voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. We have to leave. We can't stay here. It's not safe. I looked at him, my mind reeling. Could we leave? Was that even an option? The storm outside had intensified, and the road back to town was miles away. We didn't have the strength to walk, and the car might not even start in this weather. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I didn't know what to say. What was there to say? Liam seemed to read my mind. I know the storm's bad, but we can't just stay here. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there. It's not going to stop. He was right. I had no doubt in my mind that the creature was still out there, hiding in the shadows, waiting for its next move. The question wasn't whether we should leave. It was how we could leave without getting caught in its grasp again. We moved cautiously through the lighthouse, every sound amplified in the silence that had taken over the space. The building creaked and groaned around us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, just out of sight. Every corner seemed to hide something, something sinister and unexplainable. We gathered our things as quickly as we could, trying to make as little noise as possible. I grabbed my jacket and a few essentials, but every movement felt like it was making us more vulnerable. We hadn't seen the creature, but I knew it was there, somewhere just beyond our reach. My mind raced with thoughts of what it could do to us if it found us again. Would we survive another encounter? Or would this be our last night? Liam and I reached the front door, both of us holding our breath as he slowly tried to turn the handle. The door felt heavier than usual, and the cold air from outside pressed against us, as though trying to keep us inside. For a moment, I thought the door wouldn't open. I thought that we were trapped, that the thing had found a way to lock us in. But then, with a loud creak, the door gave way. We stepped outside into the storm, the wind howling around us and the rain coming down in sheets. The lighthouse, towering behind us, seemed to loom like a dark sentinel, watching us as we fled. My heart pounded in my chest, but there was no time to stop. No time to think. We had to get away. We made our way toward the truck, stumbling through the mud and rain. The storm was relentless, making it almost impossible to see, but we didn't care. We had to get to safety. I reached for the door handle, praying that the truck would start, that we would finally be able to escape this nightmare. But when I tried the ignition, the truck sputtered and died. "No," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. "No, no, no." Liam was already trying to restart it, his hands shaking as he turned the key. But it was no use. The storm had taken its toll on the engine, and we were stranded. We were trapped again. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw myself on the ground and give up, but I couldn't. I couldn't let the creature win. Not now. "Liam," I said, my voice barely audible over the storm, "we need to get inside. We're not safe out here." We didn't speak after that, but we both knew what had to be done. We couldn't stay out in the open, waiting for the creature to find us. We had to go back to the lighthouse, no matter how terrifying it seemed. We moved quickly, nearly running back to the door as the wind howled around us. By the time we got inside, we were soaked to the bone, and my teeth were chattering from the cold. But the worst part was the silence. It was as if the lighthouse had swallowed us up again, and we were alone with the darkness. I closed the door behind us with trembling hands and looked at Liam, whose face was pale and haunted. We both knew what the other was thinking. The creature was still here, and it was going to come for us. We retreated to the farthest room of the lighthouse, barricading ourselves in as best as we could. We listened to the storm rage outside, the wind howling like some kind of animal. But even with the storm's fury, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond the walls, waiting. The hours dragged on, each one more excruciating than the last. I tried to sleep, but the nightmares came again, vivid and real. I would close my eyes, only to see the glowing eyes of the creature staring back at me, its form shifting and twisting in the darkness. And every time I opened my eyes, I was back in the room, still trapped. When the sun finally rose, it wasn't a relief, it was a new kind of terror. The storm had passed, but the air was still thick with unease. The lighthouse stood silent, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. We had survived the night, but we weren't free. Not really. We stayed there for what felt like days, never leaving the lighthouse, never daring to go out into the world. The creature, whatever it was, still lingered in the back of our minds, a constant reminder that we weren't safe. We couldn't leave until we knew it was gone. And even then, I wasn't sure I would ever feel safe again. I don't know what happened to the creature. I don't know if it's still there, in the darkness, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to wander into its grasp. But I do know this. There are some places in this world that you should never go. Some things you should never see. And the lighthouse was one of those things. We eventually left, but I couldn't bring myself to return. Years have passed since that night at the lighthouse, but the memories are still vivid, as if they've been burned into my mind. I've tried to forget. I've tried to move on, to live a life that doesn't feel haunted by the shadows of that place. But no matter how far I go, I can't escape it. It follows me, lingering in the corners of my thoughts, like the creature that haunted us, watching from the dark, waiting. I don't speak about it much. Who would? How could I explain something so unnatural, so unexplainable? People think I'm crazy if I mention it. But there are nights when the memories come back, uninvited, like ghosts seeking their revenge. I'll wake up, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, and I'll hear that sound, the same sound I heard that night in the kitchen. The scratching, the breathing. It's as if the creature is still out there, just beyond my reach, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Liam and I never really spoke much after we left the lighthouse. It's not that we weren't friends, we were, but something about what happened there changed everything. I don't think either of us could fully grasp what we had been through. The trauma was too much, too overwhelming. The fear of what we had seen and what we hadn't seen kept us apart. We tried to move on, but it was impossible. It's like that night had torn a hole in our lives that we could never quite heal. I don't know what happened to the lighthouse after that. It's still there, I'm sure, perched on that rocky cliff, staring out into the endless ocean. But it'll never return. No matter how many years pass, I can't bring myself to go back. The memories are too strong, too terrifying. Every time I close my eyes, I can still see the thing in the kitchen, its eyes glowing in the darkness, its shape shifting and twisting like a nightmare. And every time I think of the lighthouse, I think of that cold, suffocating air, and the feeling that something was watching us, even when we weren't looking. I've heard stories, rumors, over the years. People say that the lighthouse is cursed, that it's been abandoned for years. Some even say it's haunted by the spirits of those who have disappeared over the years. But I don't know what to believe. Maybe there's truth in those stories. Maybe there's something more to the lighthouse than we ever knew. Or maybe we were just unlucky. Maybe we were just two people who happened to stumble into a place where things weren't meant to be seen, where the veil between this world and whatever lies beyond it is thin. All I know is this. There are some things in this world that shouldn't be questioned. There are places that shouldn't be explored, things that shouldn't be uncovered. The lighthouse was one of those places. And as much as I wish I could forget, I know deep down that I can never truly escape it. Sometimes, when the storm is raging outside and the wind howls through the trees, I feel that familiar chill crawl up my spine. I hear that scratching sound again, as if it's calling me back, urging me to return. But I know better now. I've learned that some doors, once opened, should never be closed again. The lighthouse, with its towering spires and its lonely watch over the sea, will remain a mystery, a shadow that will follow me for the rest of my days. And as much as I'd like to forget, as much as I wish I could leave it all behind, I know that I can never truly escape what happened there. I'll carry it with me forever. The creature, the fear, the silence that followed, and the haunting question, what was it? What was it that we saw that night? Was it something from this world? Or was it something else? This story takes place in a small, forgotten town tucked away in the corner of the world. A town that, on the surface, looked like any other. The kind of place where life moved slowly, almost as though it were frozen in time. It wasn't on any tourist maps, and most people who lived there didn't want to leave. For all intents and purposes, it was a town that seemed to have a charm, one that lured people in without them realizing. But like any small town, it held its secrets. The hotel sat at the edge of the town, almost as if it were an afterthought. It was a large, old building with weathered bricks, faded paint, and a large, creaky sign that hung over the entrance. It had seen better days, but it was the only place for travelers to stay when passing through. In its prime, It had been a beautiful establishment, bustling with guests. But now, it felt like something out of a forgotten era, a relic from a time that had long passed. It found myself in the town after a long drive, the kind where the hours seemed to stretch on forever. The road had been empty, and my car had hummed along the lonely highway until the town had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. The hotel had stood like a beacon in the distance, beckoning me in. It wasn't exactly the best place to stay, but it was the only one, so I checked in without much thought. There was something unsettling about the place, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The lobby had a musty smell, and the walls were adorned with old paintings, some of them crooked. The receptionist, an elderly woman with a tight-lipped smile, handed me the key to my room without saying much. Her eyes, though, lingered on me longer than was comfortable. I couldn't tell if it was curiosity or something else in her gaze. The hotel had a peculiar atmosphere, quiet, still, almost like it was holding its breath. The hallway was dimly lit, the floor creaking under my feet as I made my way to my room. As I opened the door to my room, I was hit with the distinct smell of old wood and stale air. It wasn't exactly inviting, but it was better than nothing. I set my bag down on the bed and surveyed the room. The furniture was ancient, the bed covered with a faded quilt. There were no windows, just heavy curtains that blocked out the daylight. It felt like the kind of place that was stuck in a time loop, and I was unsure whether that was comforting or unnerving. I decided to grab a quick shower to shake off the exhaustion from the long drive. The water was lukewarm at best, and the shower head sputtered with every flow, but it did its job. As I stepped out of the shower, I felt an odd sense of unease, like something was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, but nothing was there. Still, the feeling wouldn't leave me. I shook it off, chalking it up to fatigue, and got dressed. The evening was drawing near, and I knew I needed to eat. I made my way back to the lobby, hoping there might be something decent to eat in the old dining area. The place had a heavy silence to it, and the flickering lights above me only added to the eerie vibe. It felt as though the hotel was empty, save for me and the strange woman at the front desk. Yet, I could sense movement in the corners of my vision, shadows that shifted ever so slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. I walked into the dining room and was greeted by the same stillness. There were no other guests. I sat down at a table near the window, where the view of the overgrown garden outside added to the sense of isolation. The waitress, a young woman this time, brought me a simple meal. As I ate, I tried to ignore the unsettling feeling that kept creeping up on me. It wasn't the food or the atmosphere. It was something more. Something in the air, something in the walls. When I finished eating, I returned to my room, locking the door behind me. I sat by the window, watching the shadows stretch across the hotel grounds. The quietness of the place weighed heavily on me, and I found it difficult to relax. The thought that I was the only guest in the entire hotel gnawed at me, leaving me restless. I turned on the TV, hoping for some distraction, but it barely worked, static filling the screen instead of any real programming. The longer I stayed, the more I began to wonder if I was alone in this hotel. I hadn't seen another soul except for the woman at the front desk. The hallways were eerily empty, the rooms dark behind their closed doors. It was as though the hotel existed in some sort of suspended animation, frozen in time, and I was merely a passing presence. That thought made my skin crawl. As the night grew darker, the hotel felt colder. A chill ran through the room, and I pulled the blanket tighter around me. I kept the lights on, not wanting to be in the dark. I kept hearing sounds, distant footsteps echoing down the hallway. But every time I checked, there was no one there. Just emptiness. It was then that I noticed something strange about the door. The key was still in the lock, but it seemed to be slowly turning on its own. The knob twisted, then twisted back again, as though something on the other side was testing it. My heart raced as I stood up, unsure whether I should open the door or not. But before I could decide, the turning stopped, and all fell silent again. I could feel it now, a presence. It was watching me, waiting for something. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt thick, like it was heavy with secrets. There was something in this hotel that didn't belong, but I couldn't leave. I didn't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to walk out. I was caught in the hotel's grip, and something told me I needed to stay. That night, I slept fitfully, plagued by strange dreams. I dreamt of the hotel, its walls closing in on me, its halls stretching endlessly. I woke several times, drenched in sweat, and each time, the silence of the hotel seemed even deeper than before. The following morning, I woke up with a sense of unease gnawing at me. My sleep had been interrupted by strange noises, scraping sounds, faint whispers that I couldn't quite understand, and the occasional creaking of the floorboards beneath me. It wasn't enough to make me jump out of bed, but it was enough to leave me unsettled. The dreams it had felt too real, like the hotel had seeped into my subconscious, trying to communicate something to me. I tried to brush it off as my mind playing tricks after the long drive and the odd atmosphere of the hotel. I forced myself to get out of bed, reminding myself that I had a long day ahead. I needed to focus on getting back on the road. The sooner I left, the better. But for some reason, that thought didn't bring me the relief I expected. Instead, it made my stomach churn with a sense of dread. It was as though the hotel was drawing me in, holding me captive. I got dressed, trying to ignore the heavy feeling in the room. The air felt thicker, colder somehow. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting me. The hall was still empty, just as it had been last night. The walls seemed to close in on me, and the dim lighting added to the oppressive atmosphere. I made my way down to the lobby to grab some coffee, hoping it would clear my head. As I passed the front desk, I noticed the receptionist wasn't there. The place was eerily quiet, save for the low hum of the lights above me. I found myself walking toward the dining room again, where I had eaten the night before. The strange woman who had served me my meal was nowhere to be found, and the place seemed even more deserted than before. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just a slow morning. But then, something caught my eye. A door at the far end of the dining room stood ajar. It was a back door, leading out to what appeared to be a small courtyard behind the hotel. I hadn't noticed it the night before, and now that I was seeing it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The door was slightly open, as if someone had left in a hurry. The wind picked up, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves outside. It was a sound that should have been calming, but in the silence of the hotel, it felt foreboding. I couldn't resist the urge to walk toward the door. As I approached, I noticed something odd. There were muddy footprints leading from the door and trailing toward the hallway. The prints were fresh, as if someone had just walked through moments before. But there was no one around. I paused for a moment, scanning the room, but the place was still empty. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I debated for a second whether to investigate further. Something about the footprints seemed wrong. The way they were so deliberate, yet not quite natural, set off an alarm in my mind. They didn't match any shoes I had seen around the hotel, and they led into an area that seemed to be off limits. Still, my curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the trail. The footprints led me to the end of the hallway, to a small door that I hadn't noticed before. It was a service door, tucked away in the corner. The wood was old, and the paint was peeling. I wasn't sure if it was meant to be locked, or if it had just been overlooked by the hotel staff. The prints stopped right in front of it, as if the person had disappeared into the door. I grabbed the handle and pushed, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. That's when I heard it. A soft thud. It came from somewhere deeper in the hotel, distant but unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening intently. The sound was followed by a faint scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. It wasn't coming from the hallway or the dining room. It seemed to be coming from the walls. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be. I turned away from the door, but as I did, I felt the temperature drop. A gust of cold air swept through the hallway, and the lights above flickered once before dimming. It was as if the hotel itself was alive, reacting to my presence. My breath came out in a visible mist, and I shivered involuntarily. I quickly made my way back toward the lobby, hoping that maybe a cup of coffee would bring me some clarity. As I sat at a small table, trying to gather my thoughts, I began to notice something strange. The air around me felt heavier, as though it were pressing in from all sides. The windows, which I had assumed were just old and dirty, now seemed to be reflecting strange shapes, shadows that didn't match the light in the room. I stared at them for a long time, but the shapes never seemed to make sense. They were too fluid, too shifting. It was then that I heard footsteps again. Not just any footsteps. These were slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking just behind me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The hallway was still empty. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the hotel's creaking walls and old pipes making those noises. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something wasn't right about this place. I finished my coffee in silence, staring at the door, my mind racing with questions. After a few moments, I stood up and headed toward the stairs. The hotel had 2 floors, and I hadn't explored the upper level yet. I thought maybe I could find some answers, or at least some clues as to why the place felt so off. As I climbed the creaky steps, I noticed that the hotel seemed even quieter than before, the silence pressing in on me. The air was thick, heavy, like it was holding its breath. I reached the top of the stairs and found myself standing in front of a long hallway that stretched out before me. The doors to the rooms were shut tight, and there was no sign of life. But as I walked down the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the end of the hall, the door to one of the rooms was wide open. The doorframe was empty, and there was no light coming from inside. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether I should investigate. But my curiosity got the best of me, and I approached the door. What I saw inside was enough to make my heart race. The room was completely empty, but the bed was unmade, as if someone had just gotten up. There was a faint smell of something old and musty in the air. But the most disturbing part was the markings on the wall. They weren't like anything I had ever seen before. Scratches, deep gouges that looked like they had been made by something sharp. They were arranged in a pattern, as if someone had deliberately carved them into the wall. I couldn't make sense of it, but the sight of those marks sent a wave of dread washing over me. Suddenly, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't just dim. They went out completely, plunging the hallway into darkness. That's when I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, this time, closer. Closer than ever before. My heart raced, and I froze in place, listening. The footsteps stopped right behind me. I turned around slowly, but no one was there. The temperature in the hallway dropped even further, and I could see my breath in front of me. I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I leave? But the door to the hotel was far down the hall, and I felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The footsteps began again, slowly this time, but they weren't just behind me anymore. They were all around me. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound of them. And I realized something that made my stomach drop. I wasn't alone in the hotel. The hotel had never been empty. The next few hours felt like a blur, with every moment adding to the oppressive tension in the hotel. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was constantly watching me, moving just out of my sight. I had tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I was alone in an old, creaky building far from home. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself, I couldn't ignore the increasingly strange occurrences that seemed to intensify with every passing minute. After the incident in the hallway, I decided to take a different approach. I had to figure out what was going on, whether I liked it or not. I couldn't just sit idly by, waiting for something worse to happen. As I made my way back to my room, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease creeping over me. The air seemed thicker, colder. It wasn't just the usual chill of an old building. It was something deeper, something that felt wrong. I opened the door to my room and immediately noticed that something was off. It wasn't the mess it left earlier. It was the feeling in the room. The atmosphere felt charged, as though it were holding its breath. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. I scanned the room quickly, but there was no one there. The bed was still made. The curtains were drawn tight. Everything seemed normal, except for the small, almost imperceptible scratching sound coming from the closet. I froze. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a branch scraping against the window, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. It was the kind of noise that couldn't be easily explained away. I approached the closet cautiously, my pulse quickening. I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, the sound stopped. Dead silence. For a moment, I stood there, debating whether I should open the door. The logical part of me told me to just leave it alone, that whatever was happening here was better left unexplored. But the other part, the part that was now consumed by dread and curiosity, urged me to open it. I gripped the door handle and turned. The closet was empty, save for a few old coats hanging on the rod. No signs of anything strange. No footprints. No hidden messages. Just the stale scent of dust and old fabric. But as I closed the door, I noticed something. A small piece of paper, barely visible, stuck between the folds of a coat. I pulled it free, my hands trembling slightly. The paper was old, yellowed with age, and folded neatly in half. I opened it slowly, almost afraid of what it might say. The words on the paper were simple. Get out. The handwriting was jagged, as though it had been written in a hurry, with force. The message was clear, but it didn't make sense. Why would someone leave this in my room? Who was warning me, and why? The chill in the room seemed to deepen, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. I immediately left the room, determined to find out more about the hotel. I had to figure out why this was happening, why the atmosphere had turned so oppressive. I had to understand what was behind all the strange occurrences, the sounds, the messages, the feeling that I was being watched. I wandered the halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence. It was as if the hotel had become a maze, every corner more disorienting than the last. The dim lights above flickered intermittently, casting long, unsettling shadows across the walls. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. I tried to push the thought from my mind, but it lingered, gnawing at me. The walls seemed to press in on me, making it hard to breathe. As I walked down the hallway, I came across a door I hadn't noticed before. It was hidden at the end of a narrow passage, tucked away in the corner of the building. The door was old, its wood warped and chipped, and it looked like it hadn't been opened in years. I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. Something about it felt wrong, yet I couldn't bring myself to turn away. I reached for the handle and pushed the door open. The creak of the hinges was deafening in the quiet hotel, and I winced at the sound. The room beyond was dark, save for the faint light spilling in from the hallway. As my eyes adjusted, I could make out the outlines of old furniture, a chair, a dresser, and a large, dusty mirror on the wall. The air in the room was thick, oppressive, and the temperature felt colder than it should have been. It was as if the room hadn't been touched in years. I stepped inside, my footsteps muffled on the worn carpet. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trespassing in a place I wasn't meant to be. But my curiosity kept me moving. I moved toward the mirror, drawn to it, as though something were calling me from within. The mirror was clouded with age, but I could still make out my reflection. I studied it for a moment, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my chest. But then, something happened. In the reflection, I saw something moving behind me. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest, but the room was empty. No one was there. I turned back to the mirror. The reflection of myself was unchanged, but there was something else, something faint, almost imperceptible, flickering in the corner of the glass. I stared at it for a long time, unsure of what I was seeing. It was a figure, but not quite human. It was shadowy, formless, a distortion in the mirror's surface. The figure seemed to move, shifting, stretching, until it was no longer just a reflection, but something more. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay in this hotel any longer. But as I turned to leave, I felt the door slam shut behind me, trapping me in the room. I pounded on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me, and I felt the walls closing in. The room seemed to grow darker, the air colder. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps, again, circling around me. But there was no one there. The sound echoed off the walls, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I realized that I wasn't alone. The presence I had felt all along, the one that had been following me, was now right here, in the room with me. I wasn't sure how much time passed, but eventually, the door creaked open, and I bolted out into the hallway, my heart racing. I didn't stop running until I reached the lobby. I was shaking, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. The receptionist was still nowhere to be found. The lobby was eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from every corner of the room. I had no idea what was happening or why, but I knew one thing for sure: this hotel was not what it seemed. I had to leave, but I couldn't. The door to the outside was locked. It was as though the hotel itself had sealed me in. The feeling of being trapped was overwhelming. I had to get out. But as I looked around, the walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows stretching longer with each passing moment. The hotel was changing, adapting to my presence, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could survive it. The night had descended fully, and the oppressive weight of silence in the hotel seemed to thicken, almost suffocating me. Every room, every corridor felt more like a trap than a place of refuge. No matter where I turned, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of my view, watching, waiting. I had tried every door, every exit, but nothing opened. Every path I took just led me deeper into the labyrinth of this cursed building. My heart pounded in my chest as I wandered through the seemingly endless halls, desperate to find a way out. The clock on the wall ticked louder than I'd ever noticed before, each second stretching into eternity. It was as though time itself had stopped, frozen in the strange, distorted space of the hotel. There was no sign of life anywhere. The receptionist was still nowhere to be found, and the phone in the lobby had gone dead. The sense of isolation was all-consuming. I rounded a corner, my footsteps echoing off the stone floors, and that's when I saw it. The door at the far end of the hallway. It was the same door I'd seen earlier, the one I had tried to ignore. But this time, it was different. There was no longer a sense of being drawn to it, no magnetic pull. It was as if the door itself had summoned me, beckoning me forward. I stood there, hesitating, my breath shallow, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. I wanted to turn around, to flee, but something inside me told me that this was the only way forward, that I had to face whatever awaited behind that door, no matter the cost. I slowly approached the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cold, stale air wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket, and I reached out for the handle, my hand trembling as I touched it. The door opened with a soft creak, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, the room was darker than any place I had been in the hotel, as though the shadows themselves had gathered in that space, eager to hide whatever secrets it held. I stepped inside. The room was nothing like the others I had seen in the hotel. It was colder, far colder, and the walls were covered in strange black markings that twisted and writhed like living things. The air was thick with an unbearable stillness, and the atmosphere felt oppressive, as if the very walls were watching me. I shivered, but it wasn't just the cold. There was something else, a presence, a weight that settled over me, making it hard to breathe. And then I saw it. In the center of the room stood a mirror. At first, I thought it was just another old, cracked mirror, like the one I had seen earlier in the hotel. But this one was different. This one felt alive, as though it were pulsing with energy. Its surface rippled, distorting the reflection, warping the image of the room around it. I stared at it, transfixed, unable to look away. It wasn't just a reflection. It was something more, something that wasn't quite real. The mirror seemed to draw me in, and I took a step closer, my body moving of its own accord. I didn't want to get any closer, but my feet kept moving, as if controlled by some invisible force. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold glass, and in that instant, everything changed. The world around me seemed to twist, and a surge of cold rushed through me, as though I had been plunged into ice water. I gasped, my chest tightening as my vision blurred. The room was no longer the same. It was darker, the shadows deeper, and there was a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere in the distance. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air, misting before me. I turned to run, but the door, the one I had just come through, was gone. The walls were now solid, unyielding, and there was no way out. Panic surged through me, my heart hammering in my chest. I was trapped. Trapped in this nightmare with nowhere to escape. The tapping sound grew louder, closer, and I could feel something moving in the darkness, circling me. I spun around, my pulse racing, my skin prickling with the overwhelming sense that I was not alone. I was being watched, stalked, and there was nowhere to hide. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, dark and formless, moved through the shadows, its shape shifting with each step. It wasn't quite human, yet not entirely something else. It was as if it were made of the darkness itself, a creature born from the very fabric of the hotel. Its eyes, if you could call them eyes, glowed faintly in the dark, two sickly yellow orbs that seemed to pierce straight through me. I froze, paralyzed by fear, unable to move or scream. It stepped closer, its presence suffocating, filling the room with an unbearable pressure. The closer it got, the colder it became. I could feel the temperature plummeting, the air thickening with the weight of its presence. I tried to back away, but my legs felt like lead, and the darkness seemed to close in around me, narrowing the space until I was standing at the very edge of the mirror. The figure stopped just in front of me, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. It didn't move, didn't speak, but there was something in its gaze, a message, a warning, maybe even a demand. I couldn't look away. The air around me seemed to crackle with energy, as though the very atmosphere was charged with something ancient and malevolent. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice at all, but a vibration, a resonance deep within my chest, as though the sound was coming from everywhere at once. I could feel it in my bones, in the very marrow of my soul. Leave, it whispered, or at least, that's what I thought it said. The word was distorted, barely audible, like an echo from the past. Leave now, before it's too late. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My body refused to respond. I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to speak, trapped in the presence of something ancient and terrifying. The room around me seemed to pulse, the shadows shifting and writhing as the figure moved closer. Its face was now clear, and though it was a twisted, grotesque distortion of what might have once been human, there was a terrible familiarity to it. The face was mine. The reflection in the mirror showed my face, contorted into an expression of pure terror, but the real me, standing before it, was no longer human. My eyes were hollow, empty, black voids. I couldn't recognize myself. The thing in the mirror was me, but not me. It was a reflection of my fear, my desperation, my very soul. The figure in front of me smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't even a smile at all. It was a grotesque stretch of skin, an unnatural twist that seemed to mock me. And as it smiled, the room seemed to collapse in on itself. The air was sucked from my lungs, the walls closing in, and I felt myself being pulled toward the mirror. I couldn't resist. I couldn't fight it. In a final moment of sheer terror, I screamed, a sound that reverberated through the dark void, and everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the room. I was standing in the hallway again, alone. The hotel was silent, empty, but the sense of dread of being watched never left. I didn't know if I had escaped or if it had simply allowed me to leave. I stumbled into the lobby, heart still hammering in my chest, my legs weak beneath me. The air felt different now, lighter, but still charged with something ominous. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Had I truly escaped? Had I left the nightmare behind, or had it followed me back to the waking world? There was a nagging, suffocating sensation in my gut, one that told me the horror wasn't over, not by a long shot. I glanced around, hoping to see the receptionist, or at least some sign of life. But the hotel was still empty. The silence was deafening, the absence of human presence like a suffocating blanket. The front desk was untouched, just as I had left it hours, or was it days ago. There was no trace of anyone, no sign that the place had ever been inhabited. I rushed toward the door, my mind screaming at me to get out before whatever was in the hotel found me again. But as I reached for the door handle, my breath caught in my throat. The door was locked. The same door that had been wide open when I entered the building was now completely shut tight. I pulled at it, desperate, my hands trembling, but it refused to budge. Fear twisted in my chest. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. There had to be another way out. There had to be. I spun around, scanning the room. The windows, normally clear and unblemished, were now clouded over with condensation, a thick fog that blurred my view of the outside world. I couldn't see anything through the glass. It was as though the world outside had disappeared, leaving me trapped in this twisted space, a prisoner of the hotel. My heart raced as I tried the back door, then the emergency exits, all to no avail. Every single exit was either locked or completely inaccessible. The panic started to rise again, that sense of helplessness creeping back in. What was happening? Was I even real? Was I still in the hotel, or had I somehow crossed into another dimension, trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape? I collapsed onto the floor, my hands gripping my hair, pulling at it in frustration. My thoughts were a jumble of confusion, fear, and disbelief. The things I had witnessed, the mirror, the figure, the distorted reflections, what was it all? What was it trying to tell me? And then it hit me, the figure, the reflection. It wasn't just a warning. It was a promise that I wasn't going to escape. The hotel was its domain. I was never meant to leave. I was part of its curse now, forever bound to it. But I refused to accept that. I stood up, rage and desperation flooding my veins. I wasn't going to let the hotel win. I wasn't going to be trapped in its dark grip. I had to fight back, had to find a way out, any way out. I started pacing, my mind desperately grasping for something, anything, that could help me make sense of it all. The cold was biting, and I could feel my skin growing numb, but I ignored it. I focused on the task at hand, trying to think logically, to push the fear out of my mind. I had to find a way to break the curse. If the hotel wouldn't let me leave, then maybe I could make it let me go. I moved toward the front desk, looking for any clues. The dusty old ledger was still there, its pages yellowed with age. I flipped through it, hoping to find something, anything, that would shed light on the mystery. There were names, dates, and strange markings in the margins, but nothing that made sense. Nothing that explained what I was facing. Then I saw it. In the back of the book, there was a small note, scribbled in a hurried hand, almost as if someone had written it in a panic. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding in my ears as I read the words. The mirror is the key. It feeds on fear. It holds you here. Once you've looked into it, you'll never leave. You must break the reflection, or you'll stay forever. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. The mirror, of course. How had I not realized it sooner? The mirror had been the source of it all. It had trapped me, twisted me, and now it was holding me prisoner. But the note also held a glimmer of hope. There was a way out. I had to break the reflection. I had to destroy it somehow. With newfound resolve, I turned toward the door again, my hands shaking as I grabbed the handle. It opened. The fresh air outside filled my lungs, and for a brief moment, I thought I was free. But as I stepped over the threshold, something stopped me. The hotel's walls seemed to stretch out in front of me, distorting the familiar landscape. I wasn't standing outside the building anymore. The ground was uneven, shifting beneath my feet, and the sky above me was a dull, sickly color. It was the same place, but twisted, altered, as if the hotel had followed me into the real world. The chill in the air deepened, and I turned to look behind me. The door was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't a normal hotel door anymore. It was darker, the wood warped and splintered, and I could hear faint whispers coming from inside. The reflection from the mirror. It was still there. I closed my eyes, willing myself to focus. The reflection. I had to destroy it. But how? I turned back to the distorted version of the world around me. The road ahead was no longer a road. It was a dark, endless tunnel that seemed to stretch into oblivion. The trees were bent and twisted, their leaves hanging like tattered rags in the wind. Everything had become a nightmare, a version of reality I didn't recognize. With every ounce of strength I had left, I turned away from the door and began to walk. Step by step, I moved away from the hotel, from the source of the terror. But it was still there, in my mind, in my heart. The reflection. The promise. Would I ever escape? Or was I doomed to walk in this twisted world forever, a shadow of my former self, trapped in the mirror's grip? It's been years since that night. Time has a way of distorting things, bending memories into something less solid, less real. But the hotel hasn't left me. It never will. I'm not sure how long I wandered that night, lost in the strange, endless landscape outside the hotel. Every step I took felt like it could be my last. The road, the sky, the trees, they all seemed to pull at me, dragging me further into that place, a twisted version of the world I once knew. I don't remember when I found my way back to the real world, or if I ever really did. There were moments, flashes of clarity when I thought I was free, but even now, I can't trust my own mind. I've tried to make sense of everything that happened, but the truth is, I'm not sure there's any sense to be made. I couldn't forget the mirror, the reflection, the note I had found at the desk. The mirror is the key. For so long, I wondered what that meant. What was I supposed to break? How could I break something that wasn't even real? How could I fight a force so powerful that it could make me question my own existence? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the mirror. Every time I looked at myself in any reflective surface, there it was, my own reflection, twisted, distorted, just like the hotel. Like the world had turned upside down, and I was now a part of it. I couldn't escape the sensation of being watched, of being trapped in a world that didn't quite belong to me. I wasn't sure where I ended, and the nightmare began. I tried everything to forget, to live a normal life, to get back to the way things used to be. I moved to a new city. I started a new job. I surrounded myself with new faces, new distractions. But even in the busiest of rooms, I'd feel it. That pull. The sensation that something was just behind me, waiting, watching. It wasn't until one sleepless night, years after I thought I had left it all behind, that I saw it again. I was standing in front of my bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth. The reflection looked just like me, tired, worn out, maybe even a little broken. But then, as I looked closer, I saw it. The corners of my reflection began to twist. The edges blurred and distorted, like the mirror itself was alive, trying to swallow me whole. My reflection didn't look like me anymore. It was something else, something dark, something that didn't belong. I turned away quickly, almost knocking over the bathroom counter as I stumbled back. My heart was racing. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. Was I still trapped in that hotel? Was this all just another illusion? I tried to calm myself down. This couldn't be happening. Not again. But the fear, the same fear I had felt that night at the hotel, was creeping back into my bones. I wasn't sure what I was seeing, but I knew one thing for sure. The hotel wasn't done with me. I could feel it deep in my chest. The sensation of being trapped, of being locked in that place forever. The reflection wasn't just a mirror of myself. It was a doorway, a way in, a way out. And I had been foolish to think I could leave it behind. I didn't know what to do next. I had no answers, no way of fixing what had happened. There was no instruction manual for escaping something like that, something so rooted in my own mind that I wasn't sure what was real anymore. Maybe I was never meant to escape. Maybe the hotel, the mirror, the reflection, they were all part of me now. Part of my own fear, my own guilt. And so, I kept going. I moved forward, day after day, trying to keep the nightmare at bay. I forced myself to smile, to laugh, to pretend that everything was normal. But deep down, I knew the hotel was still out there, somewhere, and it was waiting. I don't know if it'll ever be truly free from it. I don't know if anyone can be. But what I do know is this: that hotel was never just a building. It was a prison, a reflection of the darkness we all carry inside us. And the more I tried to escape, the more I realized that it was already inside me, locked in place, hidden beneath layers of time, fear, and memory. Maybe that's the true horror of it all, that there is no escape, no happy ending. We're all trapped in our own reflections, haunted by the things we can't escape, no matter how far we run. As I sit here now, writing these words, I know the truth. I'm still there, still trapped in that hotel, still running from my own reflection. And maybe, just maybe, I always will be. It's a normal day, really. The kind that doesn't seem out of the ordinary at first, but somehow sticks with you years later. It was the summer of 2012 when we decided to go camping in a remote forest up north. The kind of place that most people drive past without a second thought. Not many would stop to explore it, and that's what drew us to it in the first place. My friends and I were used to spending time outdoors, hiking, fishing, and doing what young men do when they're looking to escape the hustle of city life for a while. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a fun weekend getaway. The group consisted of 3 of us. Me, along with 2 others, Dan and Rob. We'd known each other since high school and had gone on plenty of camping trips together. We were no strangers to the woods. Dan was the practical one, always prepared, while Rob was more spontaneous, and I guess I fell somewhere in between. We weren't looking for anything unusual, just a break from the everyday. The kind of trip that didn't require much thought. Set up camp, make a fire, and spend the evenings sitting around talking. Simple. We packed up our gear one Friday afternoon and headed north, the road twisting and turning as we left behind the familiarity of the city and entered the more rugged terrain. The air grew crisper the farther we went, and the dense trees seemed to swallow the landscape. It felt like we were heading into another world altogether, a world where the noise of civilization didn't reach. I remember the drive, the distant hum of the engine, the smell of fresh pine and damp earth. It was quiet, peaceful, almost like the forest was waiting for us. Arriving at the site, it wasn't like anything out of the ordinary. The forest was thick with trees that had stood for decades, maybe longer. The kind of forest you'd expect to find in old adventure novels. We set up camp on a small clearing next to a creek, the sound of water trickling over rocks providing a natural soundtrack to our evening. Rob immediately set off to gather some firewood, then started unpacking the gear, and I set about getting the fire started. There was nothing unusual about the first few hours. Just a group of friends enjoying the warmth of the fire, sharing stories, and roasting marshmallows. It felt just like every other camping trip we'd been on before. We sat around the fire, the light flickering in the darkness, the occasional crackle of burning wood breaking the silence. But as night deepened, something began to feel off. At first, it was subtle. I chalked it up to the newness of the surroundings, the unfamiliarity of the area. But there was something about the forest that felt different. Not exactly threatening, but unnerving in a way that I couldn't quite place. The air felt heavier, thicker. The trees around us stood taller than I remembered, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. Rob was the first to mention it, his voice light, almost joking. Anyone else feel like we're being watched? Dan didn't look up from his task of arranging the gear, but mumbled something about being paranoid. I laughed it off too. It was just a joke, right? But as the hours wore on, the feeling grew, and it wasn't just the three of us. It felt like the forest itself had become aware. Every time we turned our heads, it felt like something shifted in the darkness just beyond the reach of the firelight. It wasn't long before we were sitting in complete silence, none of us wanting to be the first to admit that something was off. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves carried by the wind. But it wasn't wind we heard, not really. No, this was something more deliberate, more purposeful. The sound of something moving through the brush, stepping carefully around the trees. I could feel my heart rate increase, but I didn't speak up. Rob shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes scanning the dark, but he didn't say anything either. Then there was a noise. A low, unsettling sound, almost like a voice, but it wasn't clear enough to understand. It came from deep in the forest, a voice calling out in the night. A sound that sent a chill straight down my spine. Dan looked at me, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" I nodded slowly, the unease growing within me. Rob stood up abruptly, his flashlight flicking on as he shone it into the dark woods. Nothing. Silence. No more voices, no more sounds, just the darkness. But even with the light cutting through the trees, it felt like we were no longer alone. We decided to stick together and stay close to the fire, thinking it might offer some protection. We didn't speak much after that. The weight of the forest seemed to press in on us, as if it were watching, waiting for something to happen. None of us could shake the feeling that we weren't meant to be here. That somehow we had disturbed something. As I lay in my sleeping bag later that night, I couldn't sleep. Every snap of a twig, every gust of wind, every rustle of the leaves outside seemed to get louder and louder. My mind kept replaying the strange sound from earlier, that voice calling out in the distance. Who was out there in the woods at this hour? And why couldn't we shake the feeling that they were close? It wasn't until much later that night when I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, only to be awoken by something I'll never forget. The first unsettling incident didn't happen all at once. It crept up on us, small at first, like a ripple in calm water, barely noticeable until it became undeniable. As I lay there in my sleeping bag, I kept hearing things that I couldn't explain. Every time I thought it heard something, some distant sound or strange movement, it would fade away, leaving me second-guessing myself. But there was a nagging feeling deep in my gut that something wasn't right. I had fallen into a light sleep, the kind that keeps you half-conscious, aware of your surroundings, but not truly awake. It was in this state that I first heard it, the soft rustling of leaves near the edge of our campsite. It wasn't the usual sounds of wildlife. No, this was different. It was deliberate, slow, as though someone or something was creeping through the brush, trying not to be noticed. I opened my eyes, staring into the blackness, straining to hear it again. The sound stopped. I wasn't sure if I had imagined it, so I lay there still, holding my breath, listening. But then I heard it again. The same rustling, closer this time. Not just one rustle, but a series of movements, like something was moving deliberately around the camp, just outside the circle of our firelight. My heart started to race, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my mind racing through all the possible explanations. Could it be an animal? Maybe a deer? Or perhaps a raccoon? But no, the movements were too careful, too intentional to be an animal. I slowly turned my head to look at Dan, who was lying next to me in his sleeping bag. He hadn't moved, and his breathing was steady, deep in sleep. Rob was on the other side of the fire, his face lit by the flickering flames. I glanced back into the darkness, my mind still racing. The rustling stopped again, and for a moment, everything was still. It was then that I heard something else. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was unmistakable. I sat up, quietly as possible, and looked over at Rob. He had heard it too. I could see the tension in his shoulders as he sat up abruptly, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fire. The sound stopped. "Did you hear that?" Rob whispered, his voice tight with unease. I nodded slowly, my throat dry. "Yeah, what the hell is that?" We both turned toward Dan, hoping to wake him up, but when we looked at him, we realized something was off. His breathing had become shallow, almost too quiet. Rob called out to him, but there was no response. We both sat up fully now, staring at our friend. Something wasn't right. "Dan?" I called softly, but there was no movement from him. My heart skipped a beat. I shook his shoulder lightly, hoping he'd stir. But when I touched him, I felt the chill of his skin. Cold, almost unnaturally so. "Dan!" Rob called, shaking him harder. Finally, Dan stirred, his eyes snapping open, wide and frantic. "What's going on?" he gasped, his voice raw with panic. "What's wrong?" "We heard something," I explained, trying to keep my voice steady. "Rustling in the woods. It felt off, like something was out there. But you were completely still, not moving at all." Dan blinked rapidly, still disoriented. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low and shaky. "I was asleep. I didn't hear anything." We both exchanged a look, unsure of what to make of it. Dan was the practical one, always level-headed. But something about his reaction felt off. He wasn't acting like himself. I could see the worry in his eyes, even though he was trying to brush it off. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened, it had affected him too. We sat in silence for a moment, the forest around us heavy with quiet. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, which now seemed inadequate against the oppressive darkness surrounding us. I glanced around, the trees feeling unnervingly close. That familiar sense of being watched, of something unseen lurking just beyond the reach of our firelight, crept back. Rob broke the silence. "I'm going to check it out," he said, standing up abruptly and grabbing his flashlight. "We're not just going to sit here like sitting ducks." Before I could protest, he was already walking toward the edge of the clearing, his light cutting through the darkness. I wanted to follow him, but something held me back. The woods felt like a place that didn't want us there. I wasn't sure how to explain it, but it was as if the trees themselves were watching us, their silent presence an unspoken warning. I turned to Dan, still sitting on the ground. "Stay here. I'll go with Rob." Dan didn't argue. He just nodded, though his face was pale and tense. I stood up and followed Rob, my footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. His flashlight swept across the trees, illuminating the shadows, but every time the light touched the edges of the forest, it felt like the darkness swallowed it whole. We walked for what felt like ages, but in reality, it was only a few minutes. Rob stopped suddenly, and I nearly bumped into him. He was staring at something in the distance, his flashlight fixed on a spot far deeper in the woods than we had ventured before. I strained to see what he was looking at, but all I could see was a thick, dark silhouette, a shape in the shadows. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice shaking slightly. Rob didn't answer. He just stood there, staring. I took a step closer, my heart pounding. Then I saw it. Something moving in the distance, slow and deliberate. It was too far away to make out, but I knew it wasn't an animal. The shape was too humanoid. It moved in a way that didn't seem natural, as though it were dragging something heavy behind it. Rob stepped forward, holding the flashlight out in front of him, and that's when the figure stopped. Completely still. I felt my stomach churn as the air grew heavier, colder. The forest felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We both stood there, frozen, watching the figure. Then, with one sudden, unnatural movement, it turned and vanished into the woods. No sound. Just gone. We stood in stunned silence for a long time, neither of us sure what to do. Rob slowly lowered the flashlight, his face pale and tight with fear. What the hell was that? I didn't have an answer. There was nothing in the woods that should have been moving like that, nothing that could explain it. I didn't want to stick around to find out. "We need to get back to camp," I said, my voice low but urgent. Rob didn't argue. We turned and hurried back, retracing our steps toward the fire. Neither of us said a word as we walked, both of us keenly aware of the darkness surrounding us, the oppressive silence that hung in the air. When we finally reached the campsite, Dan was sitting exactly where we'd left him, his face still tense but with a look of relief as he saw us. "I don't know what we just saw," Rob said, his voice hoarse. Dan didn't reply right away. He just nodded, his eyes distant, as though trying to make sense of it all. He looked like he wanted to say something, but his lips just pressed into a thin line. We didn't talk much after that. The fire seemed to flicker dimmer than before, the shadows stretching farther than they should have. And all the while, the strange feeling of being watched hung in the air, heavier than before. It wasn't until later that night, when we finally tried to sleep again, that the real terror began. The strange events began to pile up in quick succession after that night. The woods around us, once familiar and comforting, had become something else entirely, unpredictable, unsettling, as though the forest itself had turned against us. What had started as a single odd occurrence escalated into something more sinister with every passing hour. The peace of the campsite was shattered by the creeping sense that something was watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At first, we tried to brush off what had happened, telling ourselves that it was just the natural sounds of the forest, the wind, or the odd rustling of leaves. But as the days wore on, we couldn't deny it any longer. It wasn't the forest. It was something else. Something wrong. The mornings began to feel like a relief. We could step out of the tents, stretch in the early sunlight, and try to shake off the weight of the previous night. But no matter how much we tried to convince ourselves it was all in our heads, the tension was thick in the air. Every twig that snapped, every breeze that stirred the branches, sent us jumping. We kept our voices low, our gazes sharp, as though speaking too loudly might disturb something that lurked just beyond our sight. It was Rob who noticed it first, the strange footprints. We'd been walking deeper into the forest, exploring a part of the woods we hadn't ventured into yet. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, twisting in ways that seemed unnatural. The forest felt denser, darker, the canopy so thick that very little sunlight reached the ground. Rob was the first to spot something on the ground, just past a large rock formation where we had stopped to rest. At first, I thought it was just another animal's tracks, but as I got closer, I realized these were no ordinary footprints. "They're too big," Rob murmured, crouching down to get a closer look. "And the way they're spaced out, no animal moves like this." I knelt beside him, examining the prints. They were deep, pressed into the soft earth, as if something heavy had been walking here. But there was something off about them, something that didn't sit right. The shape was too human, but the feet, they weren't right. The toes were elongated, almost too thin, and the impressions in the dirt didn't show the usual signs of an animal's gait. No paws or claws, just smooth, unnatural depressions in the ground. It looked as though whatever had made these prints had been dragging something along with it. "What do you think?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Rob replied, shaking his head, "but I don't like it." We both stood there for a moment, exchanging a glance. The air was thick with an uncomfortable silence, and we could both feel it, the presence of something nearby. I wanted to turn and head back to camp, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the strange marks on the ground. Something in my gut told me that this was important, that it meant something we hadn't yet understood. We continued walking, but the unease grew with every step. The deeper we went, the more distorted the world around us seemed. The trees, which had once looked majestic, now loomed like dark sentinels, their shadows stretching across the ground. The air felt colder, even though the day was warm, and the wind had taken on a strange, mournful quality, like it was carrying a warning. Later that afternoon, while we were back at the campsite, things took a turn for the worse. I was sitting by the fire, trying to calm my nerves, when I noticed something strange in the distance. It was hard to make out at first, just a flicker of movement among the trees. But as I watched, I could see it more clearly. There was a figure standing just at the edge of the tree line, motionless. The figure was tall, too tall, its limbs impossibly long. Its shape was humanoid, but it wasn't human. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge our presence. It just stood there, its face obscured by the darkness. I turned to Rob, who was sitting across from me, his face drawn tight with worry. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Rob looked in the direction I was pointing, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the trees. "What is that?" he asked, his voice strained. "What the hell is that thing?" "I don't know, but we need to go now," I replied, standing up quickly. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to get away from the fire, from the campsite, from this place. But as I stood, the figure disappeared, vanishing into the shadows of the forest as though it had never been there. I took a step back, my pulse racing. "It's gone," I muttered, unsure of whether I was relieved or terrified. But even though it was gone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, lurking just beyond our sight. That night, things escalated even further. We all gathered around the fire, huddled close, the warmth of the flames offering little comfort against the growing sense of dread that hung in the air. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, making the branches creak and groan. It sounded like something was moving just beyond our camp, brushing against the trees, shifting in the underbrush. But every time we looked, there was nothing there. And then came the noises, the soft, dragging sound again, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. This time, it was closer. I could hear it coming from the forest, just beyond the ring of light cast by the fire. The rustling had turned into something more deliberate, more ominous. It was as if whatever was out there was circling us, watching us, waiting for the right moment. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. "It's back," I said, my voice trembling. "We need to check it out." "No way," Rob replied quickly, his eyes wide. "We need to stay here. Don't go out there." But I couldn't just sit there. I couldn't shake the feeling that we needed to confront whatever was happening. I grabbed my flashlight, determined to figure out what was going on. "Stay here. I'll be right back," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But as soon as I stepped away from the fire, the world seemed to change. The temperature dropped, and the shadows stretched longer, as though the forest itself was shifting, closing in on me. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. The flashlight flickered as I moved deeper into the woods, the beam of light trembling in my hand. I walked cautiously, trying to listen for any signs of movement, but the forest was unnervingly quiet. The air was thick with tension, and every step I took felt like a violation of the silence that surrounded me. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, my breath shallow, as I continued further into the trees. Then I saw it, the figure again, standing motionless just a few feet ahead of me. It was the same shape as before, but this time it was closer, its form more distinct. The long, gangly limbs were unmistakable, the way they hung at unnatural angles. And its face, if you could call it that, was a blur, a twisted mockery of human features. It had no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless expanse where a face should have been. My body froze in terror. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. My breath hitched in my throat as the figure tilted its head, almost as if it was studying me. And then, with a single jerky motion, it started to move toward me, dragging something behind it. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was paralyzed with fear. That's when I heard the voices. Soft at first, then growing louder. They weren't words, just sounds, like murmurs, low, guttural whispers that seemed to come from all directions. The sounds filled the air, swirling around me, drowning out everything else. The figure stopped, its head tilting in the direction of the voices. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though they were calling to it. And then, with a final, horrifying movement, it reached out toward me. I bolted. I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, the sound of my own footsteps pounding in my ears, the whispers still echoing in my head. I didn't stop until I reached the camp, gasping for breath, my legs shaking with exhaustion and fear. When I stumbled back to the fire, Rob and Dan were standing, wide-eyed and tense. They could see the terror in my face, the panic in my movements. "You okay?" Rob asked, his voice shaking with concern. I couldn't answer. My breath came in ragged gasps as I collapsed to the ground, my eyes darting around the camp. The figure was gone, but I couldn't forget what I had seen, what I had felt. The air had turned heavy, thick with the oppressive weight of unspoken fears and foreboding. We had crossed a line that night, a line that no one could ever return from. The strange happenings had gone from unsettling to terrifying in a matter of hours, and every fiber of my being was taut with the sense that something far darker than we could comprehend was looming over us. The woods had become a labyrinth of shadows, each one threatening to swallow us whole. But no matter how hard we tried to leave, there was nowhere safe. No escape. We were trapped. By now, none of us spoke much. The words felt meaningless, like they could never capture the suffocating dread that gripped us. We had no choice but to stay together, to huddle around the fire, and to hold on to whatever thin threads of sanity we had left. But even the fire, our only source of warmth and light, had begun to feel like a futile gesture against the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. The figure we had seen earlier, the tall, looming presence in the woods, had not returned, but its absence only seemed to deepen the unease. We kept looking over our shoulders, convinced that it was out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight, watching us. But it wasn't the figure itself that had begun to unsettle me most. It was the sudden, overwhelming feeling that we were no longer alone in the woods. The forest had taken on a malevolent quality, as though the trees themselves had come to life, twisting and groaning under the weight of something ancient and terrible. Everything about the night felt wrong. The wind had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The rustling of leaves, the creaking of branches, those sounds that had once been so familiar, had all but vanished, replaced by an unnerving stillness. Even the usual night creatures had gone silent. The air was thick, almost suffocating, like the entire world was holding its breath. I had been trying to keep my composure, but the longer we sat there, the more I felt like we were being drawn into something we couldn't control. I watched the shadows stretch around us, felt the weight of their gaze on the back of my neck. The fire's glow seemed to flicker in response, casting long, distorted shadows that danced unnaturally in the corner of my vision. My nerves were frayed, and my mind, once sharp, now felt hazy, clouded by the growing sense that something was about to break, something that we would never be able to escape. "Do you hear that?" Rob's voice cut through the tension, his words barely audible above the crackling of the fire. I froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the windless silence. But then, I heard it too, a low, rhythmic thudding, not unlike the sound of something heavy being dragged through the underbrush. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked to Rob. He was staring into the dark woods, his eyes wide with panic. "It's back," he whispered, barely able to keep his voice steady. I couldn't bring myself to answer. I didn't need to. I could feel it, the presence, closing in. It wasn't just the sound that made my blood run cold. It was the way the air had shifted. The temperature had dropped drastically, and a cold, damp fog had begun to roll in, creeping like a living thing, swallowing the woods in its wake. I turned to Dan, who had been sitting in silence, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were fixed on the same spot in the woods where Rob had been looking. He opened his mouth, but the words died on his lips. He didn't need to speak. We all knew what was happening. The ground beneath us trembled. It wasn't much, just a subtle vibration, like a distant rumble of thunder, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through my veins. Something was moving beneath the earth. Something massive, something powerful. The fire flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows. I could feel my heartbeat racing in my chest, thudding so loudly that it drowned out everything else. The whispers, those faint, otherworldly murmurs that had plagued my mind for hours, grew louder, rising in volume, in urgency. It wasn't just a voice anymore. It was an endless chorus of disembodied sounds, a maddening cacophony that filled the air, echoing through the trees and creeping into the deepest recesses of my mind. Then it appeared. It wasn't the same figure we had seen earlier, but it was something far worse. This one was larger, towering above us, its form more solid, more real. Its silhouette was still distorted, inhuman, its limbs elongated and grotesque, with joints bending at impossible angles. But there was something more. This thing was alive. Not like an animal, not like anything we had ever seen, but undeniably alive, with the wrong kind of presence. Its skin, if you could call it that, was stretched tight across its bones, like leather pulled over a frame that was too big for it. Its face was a hideous mockery of humanity, its features twisted, eyes wide and empty, mouth a jagged line of teeth that stretched unnaturally across its face. It was close now, too close. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it move with slow, deliberate steps. Its eyes locked onto ours, and I could feel the weight of its gaze digging into my very soul. There was no escaping it. There was no running, no hiding. Rob was the first to break the silence. He screamed, his voice raw with terror, as he bolted from his seat. The figure didn't move, didn't react, but its eyes followed him with that same unsettling, unblinking stare. The moment Rob turned and ran, the thing jerked forward in a sudden, inhuman motion, its limbs snapping into place as it surged toward him with an unholy speed. "Rob, no!" Dan shouted, jumping to his feet, but it was too late. The creature moved like lightning, faster than anything should have been capable of, and in an instant, Rob was gone, swallowed by the dark, vanished into the depths of the woods. The air around us went cold. I could see Dan's face, pale and stricken, his eyes wide with disbelief. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. He was shaking, his entire body trembling as he stared into the forest. his gaze lost, his mind refusing to accept what had just happened. But it wasn't just Rob who had vanished. The moment the creature took Rob, the entire forest seemed to come alive. The trees groaned and cracked, as if they too were protest the presence of this thing. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, their voices now a jumbled mess of unintelligible sounds. And then, the ground began to shift, trembling beneath our feet, as if the earth itself was beginning to unravel. I turned to Dan, my voice coming out in a strangled whisper. "We have to go. We have to get out of here." Dan didn't answer. He couldn't. He was still staring into the dark, as if hoping, praying that Rob would reappear. But I knew the truth. Whatever that thing was, whatever had taken Rob, it wasn't going to stop there. The forest was closing in around us. Before I could say anything else, the ground shook again, harder this time, and I felt the coldness, the sheer, suffocating coldness of something ancient and malevolent bearing down on us. We couldn't stay here. We couldn't even leave. There was nowhere to run. Nothing to do but wait. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, the creature stopped. It paused, its form towering above us, its gaze fixed on me. I could feel it watching me, studying me, as though it were deciding whether to let us go or to claim us too. The air grew heavier, pressing down on my chest, as if the weight of its stare was too much to bear. My mind was reeling. There were no words to describe what was happening. This was beyond anything we had ever experienced, beyond anything we could ever understand. And then, with a single, bone-chilling motion, the creature turned and vanished into the woods, retreating back into the shadows as if it had never been there. The forest was silent once again. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my heart racing, my mind a blur of panic and disbelief. Dan stood beside me, his face a mirror of my own shock, but neither of us could speak. We had just seen something we couldn't explain. Something that defied every ounce of logic, every shred of reason. Something that didn't belong in this world. The silence hung in the air like a weight, so dense it felt as if it was pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. The forest, once a familiar and almost comforting place, had now become a prison, its trees no longer just part of the landscape, but towering, oppressive sentinels. The creature that had appeared and disappeared had left something behind, something in the air, something in the very fabric of the woods. Its absence had not brought peace. Instead, it had planted a seed of dread deep within me, one that would never be fully uprooted. I stood there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to breathe, my mind still replaying the image of the creature, the way it moved with that unsettling, unnatural speed. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that it had just been some terrifying encounter that we'd all survive. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Dan, though equally shaken, had snapped out of his stupor before I did. His hands were shaking as he gripped my shoulder. "We need to go. Now," he said, his voice hoarse and urgent. I nodded, but the words felt hollow. Could we really leave? Would we be safe if we ran? The creature was still out there, somewhere, in the vast stretch of woods. There was nowhere to hide. I was beginning to understand just how helpless we were. If we stayed, we were at the mercy of forces far beyond our control. Still, leaving was the only option. The forest had become a place of nightmares, and if we didn't move quickly, I feared we would end up like Rob, vanished into the shadows, never to be seen again. Dan and I hurriedly gathered our belongings. The fire was still burning, but I didn't care. I couldn't stay in this place for another minute. I looked around, trying to steady my breathing, but every rustle in the leaves, every crack of a branch, made me jump. The darkness had swallowed the woods whole, and it felt like we were being watched, our every move observed by unseen eyes. We started to walk, then jog, our steps quick and erratic, the adrenaline pumping through our veins, urging us forward. But the further we moved, the more unsettling things became. The air grew colder again, and that suffocating silence began to return, pressing down on us from all sides. I could still hear the faint whispers in my mind, distant but growing louder, as if they were calling to us, urging us back. Dan didn't speak. Neither of us did. There were no words left. The terror had stripped us of any sense of comfort, any ability to process what had happened. We were like two terrified animals, running on instinct, trying to escape an invisible threat that had no clear shape or form. The woods seemed to stretch endlessly before us, but the path was familiar. We had been walking on this trail just hours ago, yet now it felt like we were on alien ground. It was as if the woods had changed in the time we had spent around the fire. The trees appeared to lean closer, the branches intertwining above us, casting deep shadows on the ground. My every step felt weighted, as though the earth itself was reluctant to let me go. We moved as quickly as we could, but with each step, the air grew heavier, more oppressive. The whispers in my head were growing louder, now so close that I could almost make out words. But I couldn't listen. I couldn't allow myself to acknowledge the voice. Whatever it was, whatever was causing this, it was coming for us. I heard a rustling to my left, sharp and sudden, like the sound of footsteps on dry leaves. My heart leapt into my throat, and I spun around, only to see nothing but darkness. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my racing pulse. We kept moving, stumbling over rocks and branches, but the woods were beginning to feel endless. We should have been out by now. The path should have led us to the road, to safety. But the woods seemed to twist, to stretch on, as if the land itself was keeping us trapped within its boundaries. Then something happened. I was walking ahead of Dan when I felt the air shift, suddenly colder, denser. I turned back to him and saw his face drain of color, his eyes wide with terror. He was staring at something behind me. I didn't have to turn to know. I already knew. My skin prickled, my heart hammering in my chest, and I couldn't stop the blood from draining from my face. It was the creature. It stood in the distance, its form barely visible, but its presence was undeniable. I could feel its eyes on me. They burned into the back of my skull, searing through every inch of my being. It wasn't moving this time. It just stood there, watching us. Silent, still, and patient. Dan, in a fit of panic, pulled me toward him, grabbing my arm with a vice-like grip. "We need to run. It's right there." His voice cracked, the fear evident in every syllable. But I couldn't move. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the creature. In the silence, the air felt like it had frozen, as if time itself had slowed down. The creature didn't advance, didn't make a sound. It just stood there. But somehow, I could feel its presence growing stronger. The silence was deafening now, and I could hear nothing but the pounding of my heart and the terrifying realization that we were still trapped. It was at that moment that I realized the truth. We would never truly escape. The creature wasn't just a being from the woods. It was part of the woods. It was the darkness itself, a manifestation of all the fears and horrors that had lingered in these trees for centuries. "Dan," I whispered, my voice trembling, "we can't outrun it. We need to face it." He shook his head, his body trembling with fear. No, we can't fight that thing. We just need to get away, somehow." But deep down, I knew. There was no escaping it, no running. Then, as if responding to my thoughts, the creature moved. Slowly, deliberately, it began to step toward us. Each movement was agonizingly slow, as if it was savoring our fear. With each step, the ground trembled beneath us, and the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air now, thick and heavy. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stopped. It stood there for a long, awful moment, its eyes locked onto mine, its gaze cold and unfeeling. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind was unraveling, and I could feel my legs shaking beneath me. Without a word, I turned and bolted, running as fast as I could through the trees, my feet pounding the earth with each desperate step. Behind me, I heard Dan's footsteps, and I knew he was with me, but I didn't dare look back. The terror had completely taken over, and I couldn't stop, couldn't slow down, even as my lungs burned and my legs screamed for rest. I couldn't let it catch me. We ran until we reached the road, gasping for breath, too afraid to look over our shoulders. We didn't stop. We kept running, kept moving, as if the very act of running would keep us safe. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the forest seemed to fall silent. The whispers stopped, the weight of the air lifted, and the creature was gone. We had escaped. For now. But I knew one thing for certain. The forest would never let us go. It would always be there, waiting for the next person foolish enough to wander in, to meet the thing that lurked in the shadows. The road stretched out in front of us like an endless, empty path. The trees, once menacing and oppressive, were now far behind, but the fear still clung to me, deep in my bones. Dan and I had kept running until we found the main highway. It felt like we had escaped, like we had somehow outrun the nightmare that had chased us through the woods. But the truth was, we hadn't truly left it behind. We hadn't spoken much after we reached the road, our words failing us as the shock and fear weighed heavily on our shoulders. We walked in silence, our footsteps the only sound in the night, our minds reeling from everything we had witnessed. We couldn't make sense of what had happened. The creature, the whispers, the way the forest had seemed to shift around us. It all felt like a bad dream, one we couldn't wake up from. We eventually made it back to town, and everything appeared normal, too normal, almost. The people went about their business, cars passed by without a care, and life continued as if nothing had changed. But I knew it had. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a gnawing sensation that would never go away. That night, I went home and tried to sleep, but the nightmares came. I closed my eyes, and all I could see were the trees, the creature, and that horrible, suffocating silence. It was as though the forest had infected my mind, leaving a permanent mark on my soul. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the whispers, see the creature's eyes in the dark, feel the coldness that had surrounded us. It wasn't just the memories that haunted me. It was the feeling that something was still out there, waiting, watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature wasn't finished with us. No, it had only just begun. Dan left the next day, too shaken to stay any longer. He said he was going to find a way to forget, to leave the past behind. I didn't blame him. I wanted to do the same, but it was impossible. The memories wouldn't let me. Over the next few weeks, I tried to go back to my normal life. I went back to work, tried to spend time with friends, and even started taking walks around the town. But every time I ventured too close to the woods, I felt that unease settle in. The hairs on the back of my neck would stand up, and I'd hear those whispers again, faint, but there. They were always just beyond reach, like a half-remembered dream. One evening, as I sat in my apartment, I decided to call Dan. We hadn't spoken since we'd gotten back, and I needed to hear his voice. I needed to know I wasn't the only one still haunted by what happened. Hello? His voice was rough, tired. Dan, it's me. How are you? I asked, though I already knew the answer. I'm not okay, man, he replied, his voice cracking. I can't shake it. I've been having nightmares. Every night, it's like I'm still there, in the woods, running from that thing. It doesn't stop. I hear it calling. I felt my stomach tighten. I know what you mean. It hasn't left me either. Every time I think I'm safe, I feel like it's still out there, watching me. I've been thinking about it, and I think we need to go back. We need to face whatever it is, once and for all, Dan said, his voice steady but determined. I was silent for a moment, considering his words. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to face that terror again. But I also knew that the only way to truly escape was to confront it. Are you serious? I asked, my voice shaky. You really want to go back? I don't think we have a choice. It's not just in the woods, man. It's in our heads now. We need to put an end to it. I didn't know if I believed him. How could we end something that had already taken so much from us? But in that moment, I realized he was right. The creature, the forest, It had become a part of us. We couldn't outrun it forever. We agreed to meet the next day, to go back to the woods together, to do what we should have done the first time. We had to face it, to see if there was any truth to the rumors we had heard, if there was any way to put an end to this nightmare. The next morning, we drove out to the forest, neither of us speaking as we neared the familiar stretch of trees. The woods looked just as they had before, still, quiet, and menacing. But this time, there was a feeling of finality in the air, something that made my skin crawl. We had come to confront the unknown, and we had no idea what would happen next. We parked at the edge of the forest, the vehicle's headlights cutting through the darkness. We stood there for a moment, both of us hesitant, unsure if we were truly ready for what lay ahead. But we had no choice. We had to see this through. As we walked deeper into the woods, I felt that same chill creep over me. The air was colder here, the trees looming overhead like silent watchers. We moved slowly, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet the only sound breaking the stillness. I couldn't help but feel like we were being drawn into something, like we were walking into a trap. Every step felt heavier, every breath harder to take. We walked for what felt like hours, but there was no sign of the creature. No whispering voices, no shadows creeping along the edges of our vision. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. Then we came to a clearing. The ground was soft beneath our feet, and in the center of the clearing was a large, twisted tree, its roots exposed like fingers reaching up from the earth. There was something wrong about the tree, something off. It felt like it had been here for centuries, its roots sunk deep into the ground, feeding off the land's secrets. And then I saw it. The creature stood before us, but it wasn't the same as before. It was no longer just a shadow or a figment of our imagination. It was real, solid, and alive. Its eyes locked onto ours, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me, stronger than anything I had felt before. Dan and I stood there, frozen, as the creature took a step toward us. Its form was distorted, almost shapeless, as if it was made from the very darkness of the forest itself. It didn't speak, didn't move in any way that made sense. It was just there, watching, waiting. And then, as if it had never existed, it disappeared. We stood in the clearing for what felt like an eternity, our breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The creature was gone. The woods were silent once more. But we knew the truth. The creature had never left. It was part of the forest, part of everything. And it would always be there, waiting for the next person to wander too far into the woods. It was the summer of 2005 when my friends and I found ourselves in a remote coastal town, far from the bustling city life we had grown so accustomed to. We were a group of 4, all fresh out of college, eager to escape the grind and explore the beauty of nature. We didn't expect anything too unusual, just a few days of relaxation by the sea, away from the noise of urban living. Our destination was a small, weathered lighthouse located at the edge of the town. From the outside, it seemed like any other lighthouse you might find along a rugged coastline, tall, imposing, and solitary against the vast expanse of the ocean. The lighthouse had been out of commission for years, long since replaced by modern navigation systems. It stood there like an old soldier, watching over the sea as if it had a story to tell. The first thing that struck me as we approached the lighthouse was how isolated it was. The town itself was small, a few shops, a handful of houses, and a pier where fishing boats docked. But the lighthouse, it was set apart at the very edge of the cliffs, and there was something unsettling about how it towered over the landscape. The locals spoke of it, but no one seemed to go near it. They'd glance in its direction, but quickly changed the subject if you asked about it. To us, that only fueled our curiosity. We arrived on a Friday evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The town was quiet, with only the sound of the waves crashing against the rocky shore filling the air. There was a crisp breeze, carrying the salty tang of the ocean. We made our way up the narrow road leading to the lighthouse, passing fields overgrown with wild grass. The structure loomed ahead, its white paint chipped and weathered by years of salt and wind. The lighthouse keeper's cottage, which sat next to the lighthouse, was equally rundown. Windows were boarded up, and the roof had patches of moss and lichen growing from the cracks. It felt like no one had lived there for a long time, yet there was something strangely inviting about it. It felt alive, like it had a presence, something watching us as we approached. As we pulled up to the base of the lighthouse, we were met by the caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Collins. He was the last person to maintain the lighthouse and had lived in the cottage for decades. He wasn't much of a talker, but he welcomed us inside and showed us to our rooms. There was an odd tension in the air, something unspoken between him and the lighthouse. We later learned that he had been the keeper of the lighthouse for nearly 40 years. He mentioned that the lighthouse had been decommissioned, but that he continued to stay there because it was his home. His tone had an almost wistful quality to it, as if he were tethered to the place by something more than just duty. The interior of the cottage was old but comfortable enough. Dust motes floated in the air as we unpacked, and the smell of musty wood and old furniture filled the rooms. The windows creaked in the wind, but otherwise, everything seemed normal. We sat around the small dining table and shared stories from our college days, laughing and reminiscing. But even as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The night settled in, and the house grew quiet. The only sounds were the wind howling through the cracks in the walls and the distant crashing of the waves against the cliffs. We decided to retire for the night, each of us heading to our rooms with the hope of a peaceful sleep. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt an undeniable sense of unease. There was something in the air, something I couldn't put my finger on. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the isolation of the place, the unfamiliarity of the old house. But as I drifted into sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse was somehow waiting for something or someone. The next morning, we awoke to find the weather had taken a turn. The sky was overcast, and a steady rain began to fall, the droplets tapping against the windows. Mr. Collins made us breakfast, and we sat down to eat, trying to push the previous night's unease from our minds. After breakfast, we decided to explore the lighthouse itself. The lighthouse towered over us as we stood at its base, staring up at its tall, imposing structure. The door to the tower was slightly ajar, and we hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. It was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of old wood and rust. The spiral staircase creaked beneath our feet as we climbed, each step echoing in the silence. We reached the top, and the view of the coastline was breathtaking. But there was a lingering feeling that something wasn't quite right. As we stood there, looking out over the turbulent sea below, I couldn't help but glance over at the lighthouse lens. It hadn't been in use for years, yet I swear I saw it flicker, just for a moment. A flash of light. I shook my head, dismissing it as my imagination. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. We made our way back down, and Mr. Collins, who had been silent during our ascent, spoke up for the first time in hours. He told us a story about the lighthouse, a story about the last keeper before him. The keeper had been found dead at the base of the tower, his body twisted and mangled. Some said it was an accident, but others whispered that it was the lighthouse itself that had claimed him. As Mr. Collins spoke, I couldn't help but feel a chill creeping up my spine. The air seemed to grow colder, the wind outside picking up as if in response to his words. The sense of being watched intensified, and I realized with a start that none of us had spoken since he finished his tale. Something was wrong with this place, and we were starting to sense it, but we still didn't know how far that sense would take us, how much deeper we would go into the history of this lighthouse before it became impossible to ignore. The morning after our exploration of the lighthouse tower, things began to feel off. It was subtle at first, like the small changes that occur when you're living in a place that doesn't quite belong to the world you know. The wind had picked up again overnight, its howls sounding louder against the windows. The sky was still overcast, a dull gray that seemed to hang heavy over the town. We were sitting at the breakfast table in the old cottage, sipping coffee and chatting lightly, trying to make the best of the dreary weather. The rain was steady outside, tapping against the window panes like 1,000 tiny fingers. The mood was lighter than the day before, as we were all trying to shake the odd sense of discomfort we had felt upon waking. But as I sat there, my eyes wandered to the far corner of the room, where a dusty old grandfather clock stood. It had been silent ever since we arrived, its pendulum motionless, as if time had forgotten it. But now I noticed something strange. The second hand, which had been still since we arrived, began to twitch. At first, it was a barely perceptible movement, almost as if the clock had stirred from a long sleep. I blinked, thinking I had imagined it. But when I looked again, the second hand had moved, just a tiny fraction, enough to send a ripple of unease through me. I turned to my friends, sitting across from me at the table. Their faces were still, and none of them had noticed what I had. I cleared my throat, hoping I hadn't just seen something that wasn't there. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked, my voice low, as if I feared breaking the fragile silence. The others looked at me, confused. "See what?" One of them asked, wiping a bit of breadcrumbs from his lips. "The clock. It moved." I pointed to the grandfather clock in the corner. My friends glanced at it, but it seemed like nothing had changed. "The clock's been broken since we got here," one of them said, shrugging. I thought it was just part of the place's charm. I nodded, trying to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. But deep down, something didn't sit right with me. The clock had moved, maybe not by much, but enough to make me question whether this old cottage was as quiet and lifeless as it seemed. As the day wore on, I noticed more oddities. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows more fiercely than it had before. But it wasn't the wind itself that unsettled me. It was the way it felt, as if the house was absorbing the sound. I stood near the window, looking out over the wild, churning sea below, and I could have sworn I heard something else, something faint, a whisper just beneath the howl of the wind. But when I listened closer, it was gone. I shook my head and tried to ignore it. That night, we decided to take a walk down to the shoreline, hoping the fresh air would clear our heads. The rain had stopped for a while, and though the sky was still filled with thick clouds, the sea was relatively calm, its waves crashing softly against the rocks. As we walked along the beach, we chatted, trying to enjoy the moment and dismiss any strange thoughts that had crept into our minds. But as we neared the base of the lighthouse, the mood shifted again. The sound of the waves crashing grew louder, as if the ocean were suddenly a far more present force. The air turned cold, and the wind picked up, gusting fiercely around us. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as a chill swept through the air. My friends were walking a few paces ahead, their voices muffled by the wind. But I stopped, frozen in place, as I noticed something in the distance. At the foot of the lighthouse, a figure stood, staring directly at us. It was tall and thin, a silhouette against the dimming sky. But the most unsettling part was that it wasn't moving. It was as if the figure was frozen in time, locked in place, just staring. I couldn't make out any features. It was too far away, and the figure was obscured by the dim light of the evening. But I felt a jolt of fear run through me. I glanced back at my friends, but they were still unaware of what I was seeing. I opened my mouth to call out to them, but the words caught in my throat. My feet felt like they were stuck to the sand. I couldn't look away from the figure. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, but in reality, it was probably only a few seconds. Then, just as abruptly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, melting into the shadows of the lighthouse. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But there was nothing there now, just the waves crashing and the wind howling. I took a step forward, my legs feeling heavy, and joined my friends who were now further down the beach. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice was shaky. They looked at me, puzzled. "See what?" "The figure. By the lighthouse. There was someone standing there." They all stopped and turned, looking in the direction I pointed. But the lighthouse was empty, its light long since extinguished, and the area was deserted. "There's nothing there, man," one of them said, shaking his head. "You've been staring at that lighthouse too long. The wind's messing with your head." I nodded, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. There was something about that figure, something wrong. We didn't linger by the lighthouse for long. The wind was picking up again, and the air was growing colder. We made our way back to the cottage, each of us quiet, lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the lighthouse, and that the figure I had seen was just the beginning. That night, as we sat around the fire in the cottage, the mood was noticeably different. The room felt heavy, thick with the unspoken tension. No one had brought up what happened by the lighthouse. But I could tell that we were all thinking the same thing, that something was off. I tried to push the thoughts from my mind and focus on the warmth of the fire, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The grandfather clock ticked in the corner, its second hand moving slowly again. Just as I was about to say something, the lights flickered. Once, twice, before finally going out completely. The room plunged into darkness, and I could hear the breath catch in my friends' throats. The wind outside roared louder, and I could feel the air pressing in from every direction. Then, a sound broke through the quiet, a faint tapping, like a finger rapping against the window. I jumped to my feet, heart racing, and rushed to the window, but there was nothing outside. Just the same empty yard and the endless dark ocean beyond. When I turned back to the room, I realized that the faces of my friends were just as pale as mine. We all stood there in the dim light of the fire, staring at each other, the tension thick in the air. It was no longer just a feeling. Something was happening. Something was in that lighthouse, and it was watching us. And for the first time, I realized that the place wasn't as empty as it seemed. It was alive with something older and darker than we could comprehend. The days after the strange incident at the lighthouse were unsettling, to say the least. Every moment in that cottage felt like it was stretching on forever, as though time itself was playing tricks on us. Every gust of wind outside seemed louder, the creaks of the old house growing more pronounced, more deliberate. The strange occurrences had started small, but had begun to grow, a chain of unsettling events that slowly escalated as the days went by. It all started with the noises. The wind had been howling again, slamming against the walls of the cottage as the storm rolled in off the sea. I had been sitting alone in the living room, trying to focus on a book, when I heard something from the attic above. A faint shuffle, followed by the sound of something dragging across the floor. It was so subtle that I almost dismissed it as the wind, but something about it didn't sit right. I stood up and moved toward the staircase, my footsteps slow and cautious. The house was eerily quiet except for the storm raging outside, the rain battering the windows as if the ocean was trying to break in. I paused at the foot of the stairs, listening intently, but the sound had stopped. I shook my head and decided it must have been my imagination. After all, it was an old house, and old houses make noises. But as I turned to head back into the living room, I heard it again, a soft scraping, like nails on wood. This time, the sound was unmistakable. It was coming from above. My heart raced as I stared up the dark stairwell leading to the attic. "Hey, did anyone else hear that?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty rooms. My friends appeared, one by one, from different corners of the house, looking just as confused as I felt. "What's up?" one of them asked. "Up there." I pointed toward the attic. "Something's moving around up there." They looked at each other, skepticism on their faces. "Maybe it's just the wind again," one said, but his tone was less convincing this time. "I don't know," I replied, feeling a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. It didn't sound like the wind. It's like something was, dragging itself across the floor. We all stood there, listening. The house was still, save for the distant rumble of thunder and the relentless pounding of the rain. The attic was silent now, but the unease lingered in the air like a thick fog. We stood in silence for what felt like an eternity before anyone spoke again. "Let's check it out," one of them said, breaking the tension. We moved as a group, slowly climbing the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The air grew colder as we reached the top, the temperature dropping sharply with each step. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, and as we pushed it open, the room greeted us with a musty smell that nearly made me gag. Dust hung thick in the air, swirling in the dim light that filtered through the small window. I stepped into the room, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The floor creaked beneath me as I moved forward, the strange sensation of being watched crawling up my spine. The others followed me in, their faces reflecting the same mix of curiosity and anxiety. There was nothing in the attic, no signs of anything being out of place. Just old furniture, covered in white sheets, and boxes stacked against the far wall. But then, as I moved toward the far corner, I noticed something odd. There was a faint smear of dark, sticky liquid on the floor. It didn't make any sense. It was as if something had been dragged across the floor, leaving a trail behind it. "What is that?" one of my friends whispered, pointing to the stain. "That wasn't here before." I knelt down to get a closer look, but before I could touch it, a loud crash sounded from below us. We jumped back in unison, the noise echoing through the house, as if something heavy had just fallen. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking as I looked around at my friends. We all stared at each other in a mix of fear and confusion. "Let's go check it out," I said, my voice tight. I was trying to sound confident, but inside I felt a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. We hurried down the stairs, back into the hallway. The house felt colder now, as if something had shifted in the atmosphere. The strange feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. We reached the living room, and as soon as I stepped through the doorway, I stopped dead in my tracks. The grandfather clock that had been silent since our arrival stood there, its pendulum swinging wildly, as if the clock had been in motion all along. The second hand ticked with an almost unnatural speed, like it was trying to make up for lost time. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel a strange pressure building in my chest. "Is it me, or is that clock moving faster than usual?" one of my friends asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded slowly, my eyes fixed on the clock as the seconds seemed to stretch on unnaturally. The sound of the pendulum ticked in time with my heartbeat, and I could almost feel it vibrating through the floorboards. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking now. "There's something wrong with this place." But as we turned to leave, the room went completely dark. The lights flickered once, twice, before cutting out entirely, leaving us in complete darkness. We froze, standing still in the pitch-black room, our breathing the only sound that broke the silence. I fumbled for my phone, using the light to guide the way, but the beam flickered as if the battery was dying. "Something's here," one of my friends said, his voice trembling. I could hear the panic rising in his words. "I don't know what it is, but this place is." Before he could finish, The low sound of something dragging across the floor reached our ears once more, coming from behind us, from the direction of the hallway. We spun around, but there was nothing there, just the empty darkness stretching out before us. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the series of events that had led us here, to this moment of confusion and fear. Something was in the house, something that didn't belong. And whatever it wasn't going to let us leave without showing itself. We made our way out of the living room, through the darkened hallway, the strange sound of scraping following us like an echo in the dark. It wasn't the wind anymore. It wasn't the house settling. Something was moving around us. Something was alive in that place, and it was getting closer. We reached the front door, and, with trembling hands, I grabbed the handle. But before I could pull it open, a voice, low, barely audible, whispered through the darkness, sending a chill straight through me. "You're not leaving." I turned to face my friends, my heart in my throat. But they were all frozen, staring into the dark hallway with wide eyes, not daring to move. The air had grown colder, the pressure heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. I reached for the door again, desperate, my hands shaking as I twisted the handle. But the door wouldn't budge. Something was holding it shut from the other side, keeping us in. And then I heard it again, the dragging sound, closer this time, closer than ever before. We were trapped. The suffocating silence that surrounded us in that moment was broken only by the sound of our shallow breaths. The room felt impossibly colder now, the walls pressing in around us as the dragging sound continued to grow closer, closer than ever before. Every instinct told me to run, but the door that had been wide open just moments ago, was now sealed shut as if some invisible force had taken hold of it. I pulled on the handle with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like the house itself was holding us prisoner. "Why won't it open?" One of my friends whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible over the deafening quiet. I could hear the panic rising in his tone, and I knew mine must have been the same. We were trapped. There was no escape. The door wouldn't open, and the sound of something dragging along the floor was drawing closer. Each scrape against the wood sent a shiver down my spine, as if the very walls were closing in on us. Whatever it was getting closer, and we had no way of stopping it. "Is it the wind?" one of them asked, but even they knew it wasn't. The wind didn't sound like that. I took a step back from the door, my heart pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat. The air in the room was thick with tension, suffocating, as if the house was breathing along with us. My hands were clammy as I fumbled for my phone, trying to get some light in this impenetrable darkness. The small beam flickered and sputtered out. I cursed under my breath, realizing I hadn't charged it fully. The only source of light was the dim glow from the hallway, and it cast long, unsettling shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Suddenly, the dragging sound stopped. The silence was unbearable. I could hear my own pulse ringing in my ears, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, my eyes scanning the darkened hallway. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I had to look. Something, anything, to make sense of this nightmare. And then, from the darkness of the hallway, a shape began to emerge. It was barely visible at first, just a shadow, but it quickly took form. A figure, hunched over, moving toward us with unnatural slowness. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, dragging across the floor, its body twisted in a way that made my stomach churn. It wasn't human. There was no mistaking it. The skin on its arms was pale and stretched taut, and its face, oh God, its face, was like something out of a fever dream. Hollow eyes, dark and endless, stared at us with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. Its mouth was wide, too wide, stretched into an eerie grin that sent a wave of cold dread crashing over me. It was smiling at us, but it wasn't friendly. No, this was something far worse. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill straight to your bones, the kind that promised pain and suffering. "So what is that?" One of my friends stuttered, his voice barely a whisper. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the creature. My body was frozen in place, my legs too weak to move, my throat too tight to scream. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. The creature was getting closer, dragging its body toward us, its movements jerky and disjointed, as if it didn't care for the rules of the living. The smell that came with it was unbearable, rotting flesh, decay, and something metallic like blood. It made my stomach twist, my mind racing for a way out. But there was no way out. We were trapped. Run, I finally managed to croak, the word barely audible. But it didn't matter. They couldn't move either. We were all frozen in place, terror locking us in, paralyzing us with its suffocating grip. The creature continued its slow, deliberate approach, and I felt a deep sense of helplessness, as though we were all pawns in some twisted game. There was nothing I could do. We had no way of fighting back, no way to escape. As it drew closer, I could see its features more clearly. Its face was gaunt, skin pulled tight over the skull. Its eyes, hollow and black, seemed to pierce right through me, as if it could see into my soul. It didn't speak, but I could hear its breathing, ragged, shallow, like it was suffocating on the very air around us. "Stay away," one of my friends screamed, finally breaking the silence, but the creature didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. Its grin widened impossibly, its mouth stretching farther and farther, as though it was savoring the fear radiating from us. The temperature in the room dropped, a bone-chilling cold that made my teeth ache. I could see my breath now, each exhale visible in the air, swirling like smoke. I tried to take a step back, but my legs were frozen. I couldn't move. None of us could. The creature was almost upon us now. I could hear its footsteps, slow but purposeful, dragging against the floor, dragging itself closer. My heart raced, pounding against my chest, but I could do nothing. It was as though the house itself had become an extension of that creature, trapping us in its web, keeping us still, paralyzed by fear. And then, just as it was within arm's reach, it stopped. The creature stood still, its hollow eyes locked on mine, and for a moment I felt as if everything had come to a halt. The room was suffocatingly silent, the only sound the rapid beating of my heart. And then, without warning, it lunged. I barely had time to react. I heard the screams of my friends as the creature reached out, its long, twisted fingers grabbing for us. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around us as we tried to break free, tried to run, but it was too late. The world around us warped, the walls shifting as if the house itself was alive, bending and twisting with the creature's movements. I felt a cold, clammy hand grab my arm, and I was yanked backward. My body hit the floor hard, the air knocked out of me as I struggled to get up. My friends were screaming, the sound echoing in the suffocating darkness, but I couldn't see them anymore. The room was spinning, everything blurring together, and I couldn't tell where the creature ended and where the house began. Suddenly, the pressure released. The weight on my chest disappeared, and the screaming stopped. I gasped for air, my mind racing as I pushed myself up from the floor. The room was still. The creature was gone. The door to the outside stood wide open now, the storm outside still raging, but the silence in the house was almost deafening. We were free, but we didn't feel free. We were shaken, our hearts still pounding in our chests. The image of that creature burned into our minds. We had escaped, but what had we escaped from? What was that thing, and why had it allowed us to leave? None of us spoke as we stumbled toward the door, too scared to look back. We stepped out into the storm, the rain pouring down, but none of us dared to turn around. We didn't need to. We knew the creature was still there, still lurking in the darkness of the lighthouse. We stood outside the lighthouse, drenched to the bone from the storm, but none of us seemed to care. The rain pounded down around us, the howling wind whipping our clothes and hair, but it all felt like a distant noise, far less important than the events we had just witnessed. Our breaths came in ragged gasps, the adrenaline slowly fading, leaving only a heavy weight of disbelief and terror. No one said a word for what seemed like an eternity. We were all too stunned to speak, The creature, that monstrous thing, had released us from its grip, but I could feel it lingering in the back of my mind, like a shadow that refused to leave. What had just happened? What had we seen? And most terrifying of all, what did it want? None of us knew the answers. We had fled. We had made it out of the house, out of that nightmare, but there was no sense of relief. There was only the emptiness of not knowing what we had just encountered. Are we really safe? One of my friends finally asked, his voice shaky, breaking the silence. I glanced over at him, my heart still racing, and I didn't have an answer. How could I? There was no way to explain what had happened, no way to make sense of it. We had been trapped in a house with something that wasn't human, something that didn't follow the laws of nature, something beyond the realm of explanation. I don't know, I whispered, staring at the ground, unable to meet anyone's eyes. But it's gone now. It has to be. The wind picked up, the storm battering against us, as if trying to push us back toward the lighthouse, to drag us back into the dark, twisted house. But we didn't move. We didn't even look back. There was no need. I knew, deep down, that whatever had been in there, whatever had followed us, was still inside, waiting, watching. We weren't free, not really. I forced myself to take a deep breath, focusing on the here and now. We were outside. We were alive. And that was more than we could say for a few moments ago. We began walking away from the lighthouse, our steps slow and hesitant, as if we expected the earth beneath us to open up at any moment and swallow us whole. But the farther we moved from the lighthouse, the more the weight on my chest began to lift. The storm, though harsh, felt almost cleansing. The cold rain, though uncomfortable, was a reminder that we had survived. But none of us were the same. We had left the lighthouse behind, but we had also left behind parts of ourselves, pieces of our sanity that would never return. We couldn't shake the images of what we had seen, the creature's twisted form, its hollow eyes, the suffocating cold that had filled the room. And we couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in us, something deep and irreparable. We had experienced something that was not of this world, and we couldn't just go back to life as usual. We can't just pretend this didn't happen, one of my friends said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, knowing he was right. We couldn't pretend. But what were we supposed to do? Who could we tell? Who would believe us? How could we explain the unexplainable? The thought of going to the police, of trying to make someone understand what we had witnessed, seemed laughable. Who would listen to a group of terrified people claiming that a creature had tried to drag them into the depths of an abandoned lighthouse? We had to deal with this on our own, or not at all. But that didn't mean it would go away. The question loomed in the back of my mind as we made our way back to town. What was that thing? Where had it come from? And why had it let us go? The more I thought about it, the more it unsettled me. I couldn't understand it. It didn't fit into any framework I knew. There were no logical answers to any of it. The creature had been something primal, something that defied every law of nature. It was a nightmare come to life, and I couldn't escape it. I needed to know more. We reached the town at last, wet and cold, but the comforting hum of everyday life seemed so far away. I was disoriented. The people around us went about their business, oblivious to the terror we had just faced. They smiled, laughed, and lived their ordinary lives, unaware of what had happened just miles away. We need to go back, I said suddenly, my voice firm despite the lingering fear. My friends looked at me, confusion in their eyes. Back? Are you out of your mind? One of them demanded. What are you talking about? I need to go back to the lighthouse. I need to know what happened, I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. They stared at me, speechless for a long moment. I could see the fear in their eyes, the same fear that had gripped me inside the lighthouse. No, one of them finally said, shaking his head. No way. That place. It's not right. We shouldn't go back. I have to, I insisted. There's something there. Something I need to understand. We need answers. None of them agreed with me, and I knew they wouldn't. But I also knew that I couldn't just walk away. I couldn't let that thing, whatever it was, slip back into the darkness without knowing what it truly was. The thought of facing it again terrified me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story, something we had missed, something we hadn't understood. And the only way to find out was to go back. "I'm going," I said quietly. They didn't stop me, but as I walked away from them, I felt their eyes on my back, their fear in every step they didn't take toward the lighthouse. I didn't blame them. No one wanted to face that nightmare again. But I had no choice. I made my way back to the lighthouse, the storm still raging around me, as if the world itself was warning me to turn back. But I pressed on. Each step felt like a battle, the darkness pressing in around me, but I couldn't turn back. The answers were out there, and I had to find them. When I reached the lighthouse again, I stood there for a long time, staring at the building that had held so many horrors. My body trembled, not from the cold, but from the anticipation of what I might find. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The silence that greeted me was deafening. The house was as still as it had been when we fled, but this time it felt different. The air was thick, heavier than it should have been, as if something was waiting, something was watching me. But I couldn't let that stop me. I walked through the rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. I couldn't explain why I was doing this, why I needed to face whatever had been in there, but I had to. And then, at the end of the hallway, I found it. A journal, a dusty, leather-bound book, lying abandoned on the floor, as if someone had dropped it and never returned. I picked it up, my hand shaking, and opened the first page. Inside were notes, sketches, and strange symbols. The handwriting was uneven, frantic, and it became clear that whoever had written this was driven mad by the same thing that had terrorized us. The creature, the one that had haunted us. It had been here before. It had claimed someone else, and that person had tried to understand it, just as I was trying now. But their search had led them nowhere, and mine too would likely lead me nowhere. I closed the journal with a trembling hand, knowing that I would never understand the truth of what had happened at that lighthouse. But I also knew this. The creature, the darkness, it was still out there, still lurking, still waiting. And I would never forget the horrors I had witnessed. But perhaps, in some way, that was the only resolution we would ever get. The answers we sought were buried in the past, and there was no escaping them. The wind howled outside, sending eerie whispers through the cracks in the walls. But all I could focus on was the unsettling silence that had overtaken the lighthouse. The air was thick with history, with secrets I couldn't hope to understand. I had come here seeking answers, but in the end, I was only left with more questions. Questions that seemed to reach beyond the realm of comprehension. I thought about the others, the ones who had stayed behind, waiting for me to return. They would never understand why I had to come back here. They would never know the pull I felt, the desperate need to know what had happened in that place, to uncover the truth that had eluded us all. But now, standing alone in the place that had haunted our every step, I realized something that sent a chill through my bones. The truth was never meant to be found. The creature, the thing that had tormented us, was just a fragment of something far older, far more terrifying than we could grasp. The journal, with its frenzied notes and cryptic drawings, offered only a glimpse into a world we were never meant to see. And now that I had uncovered that glimpse, I knew there was no turning back. The darkness, the fear, the madness, it was all a part of something that stretched far beyond the lighthouse. We were merely pawns in a game we didn't understand, a game played by forces much larger than ourselves. I looked down at the journal again, my fingers brushing over the brittle pages. The ink faded by time, but still legible enough to reveal the haunting truth. Whoever had written these words had tried to understand the creature, had tried to make sense of the inexplicable. But the more they wrote, the more they seemed to lose themselves in the search. There were pages upon pages of drawings, distorted faces, monstrous shapes, strange symbols, and in the margins, frantic scrawls that hinted at the writer's descent into madness. The more they looked, the deeper they fell into the void. And now, here I was, standing in their footsteps, teetering on the edge of that same abyss. But I wasn't sure I could turn back anymore. Part of me wanted to escape, to leave this forsaken place and never look back. But another part of me, the part that had found this journal, wanted to keep going, to keep searching for the answers that would explain it all. What was the creature? Where did it come from? And why had it allowed us to escape? The answers were here, in the lighthouse, in the journal. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized some things weren't meant to be understood. Some things were meant to remain in the shadows, hidden from human eyes, locked away by time and memory. And in seeking to understand, I had opened a door that should have stayed closed. I set the journal down on the dusty table, my fingers trembling as I left it behind. There was no sense in keeping it, no reason to carry it with me any longer. The knowledge it contained was a poison, a toxin that would only continue to eat away at my sanity, at my very soul. I had already seen enough. I had already felt the terror, the deep, consuming fear that came with confronting the unknown. It wasn't worth it. Not anymore. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest as I stepped back into the storm. The lighthouse stood behind me, its towering silhouette casting a long shadow against the darkened sky. But I knew I couldn't go back. I couldn't face it again. I had no answers, no closure, only the haunting memories of what had happened here. As I walked away, the rain beating against my skin, the wind howling in my ears, I tried to push the thoughts of the creature from my mind. I tried to block out the images of its twisted form, the suffocating darkness that had swallowed us whole. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, still watching, still waiting. And though I couldn't explain it, I knew one thing for certain. The lighthouse would always be with me. The world had moved on. People continued with their lives, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded just a few miles away. But I couldn't escape what I had seen. I couldn't forget the terror that had seeped into every corner of my mind. And as much as I wanted to, I knew I would never be able to forget the lighthouse. It had changed me, and it would always be a part of me. I had no answers, no explanation, just the knowledge that some things were better left in the dark. Some doors were never meant to be opened, and some stories, no matter how much we craved them, were never meant to be told. So, as I walked away, the storm raging around me, I could only reflect on the one thing I had learned, that there are forces in this world, things beyond our understanding, that we are not meant to confront. And the more we try to unravel them, the more they consume us. I would never be the same, and neither would the others. We had left the lighthouse, but in many ways, it had never truly left us. As the rain soaked through my clothes, I looked back one last time at the distant silhouette of the lighthouse. A shiver ran down my spine, but I didn't turn back. I couldn't. And so, I walked on, knowing that the memory of the lighthouse, and whatever dark force resided within it, would stay with me forever. Some things are better left forgotten. Some things should remain hidden in the dark. The lighthouse was one of them.